Then I changed it to mi pelo vivo. I changed it. So when I think about writing, escribiendo presencia afro, for me, it's about me. It's about the raising of my own consciousness and using writing as a tool, as our ancestors have always used writing since the days of abolition, as a tool, as a healing balm, as a weapon for our liberation, for our absolute liberation. And it begins with the liberation of our minds. And so when Bob Marley, says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds, we have to really take that into our hearts. And so writing for us is not an intellectual process. Writing for me is not an intellectual process. I don't sit at an L-shaped desk, even though that's nice, right? That is nice to sit at an L-shaped desk. And we deserve to sit at L-shaped desks. We deserve to sit in nature and in beauty and go on a retreat and, that's cool. We deserve that too. I wanna just, my time is running out, so I wanna just say also for me, writing is about honoring my literary mothers, and all of those are Black women. When I was I started loving poetry with Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson when I was 12 years old, because that was how I was introduced to poetry. And then I discovered Ntozake Shange and Sonia Sanchez, Maya Angelou, Gwendolyn Brooks, Naomi Long Majette, these are the literary mothers. And then yes, Julia de Burgos también, but not until I was 25 years old. My literary mothers come from places like Chicago and Detroit and New York City and Puerto Rico. And writing is also about being empowered by the words of those who influence us. And I wanted to just also mention Miriam Jimenez Roman, who said to me 10 years after I wrote and published Ode to the Nuyorican, which became Ode to the Diasporican, where pelo malo became pelo vivo, mis manos trigueñas became mis manos morenas, because she said, Mariposa, do you know the etymology of the word trigueña? Do you know that it comes from the word trigo? I said, no. Now, of course, by this time, I was already a poet. I was already, I think I had already performed in, I don't know if I had performed yet at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, but it was 10 years after I published the poem. And she said, yes, why would you want to liken yourself to the color of wheat? And I said, oh, wow, okay, well, I'm gonna change that. So I changed it to mis manos morenas. And morena for me is a powerful word that for me, I prefer moreno y morena because, viene de los moros, that whoever wants to say that, pay tribute to our Spanish heritage. Well, the Moors, invaded and ruled Spain and, left it a lot of their cultural heritage that's still with us today. And also for me, morena is a term that I use in solidarity with my African American sisters. And I think that I just would like to end with Boricua, morena, gracias.
Hola, buenas a todos, buenos días. Bueno, a ver cómo empiezo. Bueno, desde ayer que llegué aquí a la Cumbre Afro, hay 3 palabras que se han repetido insistentemente y que creo que me sirven como referencia a la hora de hilar un poco mi propia experiencia, ¿no? a nivel literario, en la forma en la que yo quiero expresarme como escritor y sobre todo trasladar la experiencia de lo que creo que significa ser africano o tener esa presencia en mi obra de lo africano, ¿no? Y esas 3 palabras son resistencia, lucha y reconocimiento. voy a quedarme con, fundamentalmente, esta posición con reconocimiento. Yo soy, o sea, mi familia viene de Guinea Ecuatorial, mis padres vienen de Guinea Ecuatorial y yo nací en Madrid, mis padres tuvieron pues 4 hijos, entre ellos yo, y bueno, lo que significa crecer en España, en este caso en Madrid, como hijo de 4 guineanos, pues es una cosa que yo no era consciente en mi relación con otros niños, en mi relación con otras personas, pero según van pasando los años, lo que significa para mí ser negro, o mi experiencia es ser una persona negra en España, se convirtió en, podríamos decirlo así, una experiencia de soledad. Porque al salir a la calle yo estaba con otros niños, los cuales yo nunca me diferenciaba con esos otros niños, nunca me sentí diferente, pero la diferencia se hizo patente en el trato que tenían hacia mí, ¿no? Y es que en el momento cuando yo me di cuenta, yo empecé a ser consciente de que soy negro. Y bueno, en el espacio familiar, ser negro no es una cosa extraña, pero yo con mi familia éramos los únicos, ¿no?, con los que podíamos experimentar esa sensación de, bueno, de no estar en conflicto, en la diferencia. Por lo tanto, para mí crecer y nacer en España implicaba un sentimiento de soledad. Al contrario que creo que lo que puede suceder aquí en Puerto Rico y en otras comunidades afrocaribeñas, donde lo africano se ha configurado desde el principio como una comunidad, como unas relaciones, ser, en mi caso, africano, de origen, nacer en España, crecer en España y socializarme en España implicaba también un aspecto de soledad. En ese sentido, el fenotipo, ¿no?, a mí me delata, como podría delatar a cualquiera, para designarme que yo soy negro, ¿no? Pero existe un conflicto mucho más allá, incluso a través de esto, porque mi propia experiencia de ser negro a través del contexto familiar, que es limitado, tampoco me hacía sentirme a la par con otras personas negras. A veces te juntabas con otras personas negras que tenían experiencias muy diferentes, incluso desde el racismo, pero incluso lo que es la experiencia familiar, por la religión, por las culturas, Entonces, llega una pregunta sustancial en mi vida que es, ¿qué significa ser africano? ¿Qué significa ser africano? Africano no es simplemente el fenotipo, no es el hecho de tener un color de piel, ¿no? Y esa pregunta profunda está ahí, porque al final se establece un cuestionamiento que traspasa el tiempo, y constantemente esa pregunta se convierte en una especie de persecución, ¿no? ¿Quién eres? ¿De dónde vienes? Eso está siempre ahí. Puedes responder la pregunta, puedes ignorarla, pero siempre va a estar ahí. De alguna forma, el ambiente te presiona a responder. Y hay muchas formas de enfrentarse a esto o de respuestas, ¿no? Y yo creo que una de las cosas que pasa en España, fundamentalmente con todos aquellos que hemos crecido y nacido en España como personas negras, es que nos sentimos solos de alguna forma. Solos o no representados, o no reconocidos, o las tres cosas a la vez. En ese sentido, cuando yo quiero manifestarme como escritor, tengo que aprender a situarme. ¿Quién soy yo? Pero no solo quién soy yo para conmigo mismo, sino quién soy yo para los demás, para con los demás, ¿no? Es intentar establecer o reconocer un vínculo. ¿Cuál es ese vínculo? Porque cuando yo tuve 24 años me fui a Guinea Ecuatorial, fui solo, con muchas ínfulas de aventurero, descubrir cosas que desconocía, en una fantasía que yo me había creado sobre lo que es África, sobre lo que es Guinea, sobre lo que es mi cultura, sobre lo que son mis orígenes, donde podría sentirme seguro. Y cuando llego a Guinea me dicen que soy un blanco. Entonces llego a Guinea, soy blanco. Estoy en España, soy negro. O sea, me siento desubicado. no soy de aquí, no soy de allá. Pero me di cuenta de que ellos tenían razón. Llego a África, soy blanco, porque desde su experiencia, desde lo que ellos entienden, la cultura indoeué no tiene una palabra para designar lo que es la raza en sí, como decir blanco o negro, no existe. La palabra que ellos utilizan para designar a aquellas personas que son blancas es metangani, utangani, lo cual es un compuesto de dos palabras. Está la palabra moto, que significa persona, y está moto angani, angani, que significa ajeno, persona ajena, una persona que no pertenece a la comunidad, una persona que no está dentro de las costumbres, de las herencias. Y entendí de esta forma que para que yo fuera parte de aquello que consideran ser indoeué, tenía que formar parte de la comunidad, tenía que formar parte de las costumbres y tenía que reconocerme también entre esas costumbres. Esto es curioso, ¿no? Porque al final yo nací en un sitio donde automáticamente por una cuestión de color de piel hay gente que se dice que no eres de allí. Da igual que hables el idioma como hablan ellos, da igual que tengas las costumbres, da igual que compartas, no eres de allí por una cuestión de fenotipo. En Guinea Ecuatorial, en este caso en la cultura en general de Guinea, tú no eres de allí porque no compartes, no partes del compromiso con la comunidad en sus tradiciones. De hecho, existen ritos de iniciación. Estos ritos, si tú no estás iniciado en la comunidad, tú no formas parte de la comunidad. Da igual que hayas crecido y nacido allí, tú no formas parte de la comunidad. Entonces, desde este sentido, ¿qué significa ser africano? Porque más allá del hecho de nacer y crecer, existe una participación. ¿Y qué es esa participación que nos hace esenciales a lo que vivimos, a lo que compartimos, que nos hace reconocernos como parte de todo aquello que creemos que es común? ¿No? Yo creo que ahí está el secreto, ¿no?, de estas preguntas, para mí, ¿no? Porque como negro, si me puedo situar ahí como negro, siempre habrá otras personas que tengan experiencias muy diferentes a la mía y no tienen por qué coincidir y no tienen por qué tampoco entrar en conflicto. Entonces, más allá de la diversidad de experiencias, más allá de la diversidad de lo que cada uno vivimos y experimentamos y tenemos en nuestros corazones, eso que llamamos africano tiene una respuesta de alguna forma, que esa es de alguna forma mi trabajo como escritor, ¿no? ¿Qué es dónde me quería situar? ¿Qué es lo que quería aportar? ¿Cómo me quería conectar con los demás? Al final de lo que estamos hablando es de un tipo de vínculo. ¿Cuál es el tipo de vínculo que estamos construyendo, no solo en el presente, sino en el pasado, también en el futuro? ¿Cuál es el vínculo que nos hace reconocernos, construirnos y reconfortarnos para dar constancia y perseverancia, ¿no?, en ese sentimiento en ese proceso que podríamos llamar no solo reconocimiento, también resistencia? Y es así como para mí la literatura ha nacido como una forma de continuidad, ¿no? Porque yo he querido dar continuidad a todo aquello que me precede y de alguna forma hacerlo presente, pero más allá de hacerlo presente, que continúe en el futuro. Cómo yo quiero que todas esas cosas se trasladen desde mí hacia el futuro. ¿Qué es lo que yo voy a dejar? ¿Qué es lo que yo voy a construir? Y sobre todo, ¿qué es lo que yo voy a compartir para que esas cosas puedan perdurar? ¿Y por qué? Porque al final y al cabo, la modernidad nos ha puesto una encrucijada donde no tenemos la obligación de estar enganchados a una identificación cultural específica per se. Podemos de alguna forma diluirnos o buscar en cuestiones mucho más alejadas de lo que nos antecede, ¿no? Y tendríamos que preguntarnos cuál es el valor de tener que pertenecer a una comunidad, cuál es el valor de tener que pertenecer a una cultura y las cosas que compartimos, porque al final todo puede ser intercambiable. Podríamos hacer un juego constantemente de travestismo en el que intercambiamos cosas, ¿no? Entonces, ese es el verdadero valor, y ese es el valor esencial que yo creo que cuando te sitúas frente al espejo y te sitúas con esta honestidad, estás intentando dar el valor a tu vida como ser humano en todo aquello que te ha sido heredado. Y descubrir esas herencias significa descubrir el amor de las personas que te antecedieron y las que están en el presente, con toda la frustración, todo el dolor, todo el odio y toda la destrucción. Hacer un ejercicio de descubrimiento, de indagación que haga entender que existe un sentido y que existe un valor a tu experiencia vital que va mucho más allá incluso de ti mismo. Eso es el amor. No quiero trasladar una idea del amor que sea cursi. Para mí el amor es una ciencia, y es una ciencia en la cual las cosas se trasladan mucho más allá de lo imposible. Las palabras son aquellas herramientas que se trasladan mucho más allá de lo imposible, porque en ellas están encerradas la historia de generaciones, de pueblos, de personas que antes que tú estuvieron ellos. Y ese poder transmisor de la palabra encierra todo. Por ello, cuando yo me enfoco como escritor, estoy conectando con el más allá, estoy conectando con aquellas personas que antes de mí, estoy conectando con el futuro, intentando visibilizar aquel lugar que va a llegar, que no sé cuál es, pero sé que va a llegar, que trasciende a mi propia vida como persona en el tiempo, pero en el cual estoy conectado. Estoy conectado y siento la responsabilidad en una forma, en una manera que me ha sido heredada en estas tradiciones, en estas experiencias que pueden ser luchas, pueden ser resistencias, pero ante todas son sinónimo de vida, y la vida, como su complejidad, creo que tiene el enorme mensaje de amor y estar por encima de todas las vicisitudes o de todos los problemas, ¿no? Entonces, mi trabajo como escritor, mi primera novela, que se llama Heredarás la Tierra, quería poner de relieve el traspaso generacional de unas personas hacia otras, en este caso el paso que tuvieron mis padres de Guinea Ecuatorial a España, y de alguna forma llenar ese hueco que había quedado olvidado y silenciado, ¿no? Del que se habla muy poco y del que se sabe muy poco. Y posteriormente, según he ido evolucionando como escritor, hay una cosa que me preocupa mucho ahora, que tengo la sensación, ¿no?, desde mi perspectiva, desde mi trabajo personal, que al ser escritores que tenemos esta enorme carga en el que nos ha puesto una encrucijada donde lo africano está siempre casi una cuestión casi de resistencia, de ir en contra de, necesitamos también mirar hacia el futuro, no solo estar mirando al pasado y de alguna forma reivindicando, sino también tenemos que ocupar el futuro como escenario. ¿Cuál es nuestro futuro? Y reescribir en el futuro cuál es nuestro escenario, cuáles son las verdaderas aportaciones que desde lo africano, desde esas herencias africanas, que superan lo que es el continente, que superan lo que es la geopolítica, tiene un valor esencial para la vida, para construirnos, para preservarnos y sobre todo para evolucionar como personas. Esa es mi aportación. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Es verdaderamente muy emotivo volver a Puerto Rico después de varios años, desde que María nos impidió a tantos volver y reencontrarnos con personas que en este país nos son muy queridas y a las que afortunadamente esta cumbre me ha permitido volver a abrazar y volver a tener frente a mí, como debe pasar para que la amistad siga siendo ese proceso infinito en el cual aprendemos los unos y las otras de los otros. En esta ocasión, la invitación ha sido a hablar sobre la representación en nuestra escritura, en nuestros textos, de cuerpos afrodescendientes, de cuerpos afroamericanos. Y hoy es un día muy particular en el que además estamos celebrando el Día Mundial de la Poesía, así que felicidades a todos los poetas. Es también el Día Mundial del Títere, así que felicidades teatreros, gente que me son muy querida y dos grupos a los que pertenezco con muchísimo orgullo. Y también como persona mestiza pertenezco a esa pregunta que de alguna manera nos hace esta mesa. Una pregunta que, lanzada hacia el panorama cubano, puede tener ahora mismo distintas resonancias y sobre todo muchas inconformidades en términos de respuesta posible y de respuesta también todavía imposible. Hace 10 años, estamos justamente a punto de cumplirlo en solo 2 días, un importante intelectual cubano, Roberto Zurbano, publicaba un artículo en el New York Times que provocó una especie de escándalo interno en Cuba y que obtuvo determinadas resonancias también fuera de Cuba. El título de ese artículo en inglés se traducía como "Para los negros en Cuba, la revolución aún no ha comenzado". Y aunque el título reduce y condensa en cierto sentido, no precisamente acorde con lo que el texto estaba presentando, ese título bastó para que Roberto Zurbano no solo desapareciera de la vista del público durante un determinado momento, sino para que perdiera su puesto como director de la editorial de Casa de las Américas, una de las instituciones culturales más importantes de los últimos 63 años en la vida cubana. ¿Qué decía ese artículo? Bueno, en realidad expresaba preguntas y cuestionamientos acerca de cómo el proyecto social de la revolución había cumplido o no las expectativas de lo que prometió en un primer momento con respecto a este tipo de circunstancias. La revolución, sobre todo en el primer momento de su gran frenesí, entre 1959 y 1963-64, pareció asumir una serie de cuestionamientos que venían, por supuesto, de la época colonial, de la época republicana, pero lo solucionó aparentemente haciendo elipsis sobre muchos de esos puntos de incomodidad que la sociedad cubana podía contener. Al crear instituciones que se encargaron de asumir esas problemáticas, por ejemplo, la Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, se supuso que la mujer cubana en la revolución ya tenía resuelta una agenda completa de vida, dentro de la cual solo podía representarse como mujer, como revolucionaria, como madre, como obrera, pero no dentro de otros grupos de posturas y actitudes en la vida que quedaban fuera de ese margen. A la población afrodescendiente cubana no le tocó ni siquiera esa suerte y el problema negro, para decirlo como se decía desde el siglo XIX, continúa en Cuba de distintas maneras. Estando en Chicago el año pasado, recibí la noticia de golpe, mientras visitaba el museo dedicado al arte mexicano de esa ciudad, acerca de la muerte de Eugenio Hernández Espinosa, el más importante dramaturgo cubano que se encargó de presentar a lo largo de un amplio conjunto de obras los conflictos del cuerpo, del hombre y de la mujer afrodescendiente en Cuba. En 1967, Eugenio había estrenado María Antonia, un clásico del teatro cubano, dirigido por Roberto Blanco, y esa obra puso por primera vez en el amplio escenario del Teatro Mella y ante el público cubano un cuadro de costumbres que afortunadamente salía del costumbrismo, de los límites del costumbrismo, para presentar esas interrogantes del cuerpo de esta mujer, de este símbolo de libertad, de independencia, de esta suerte de Carmen tropical y cubana que era María Antonia y que pagaba con su vida, por supuesto, los atrevimientos de querer elegir ella el hombre y la vida con la cual podía continuar. La obra fue un suceso en ese momento, fue uno de los grandes éxitos de Eugenio Hernández Espinosa y en los años 70, cuando se impuso una política cultural mucho más regresiva en nuestro país, la obra desapareció de la cartelera, su producción fue quemada, el director terminó alejado de la vida teatral durante varios años y el propio Eugenio no vino a ser rehabilitado hasta que en 1976 ganó con una obra titulada La Simona el premio Casa de las Américas. Poco a poco su teatro regresó, María Antonia volvió al escenario y hoy recordamos todos los cubanos que pudimos ver a la gran actriz cubana Hilda Oates interpretando el rol protagónico, como hoy entraba a escena y todo se estremecía. Eugenio fue consecuente con esa voluntad de seguir presentando a lo largo de su teatro todas las cuestiones y preguntas que el cuerpo de una figura afrodescendiente significaba en la cultura cubana. Podemos enlazar e identificar su trabajo hoy como podemos reconocer con orgullo en cualquier lugar del mundo una pieza de Wilfredo Lang, en una galería, en un museo. Pero al mismo tiempo esa noticia me llegó justo en el instante en el que poco después, cuando empieza a aparecer en distintos periódicos del mundo y en distintos periódicos sobre todo concentrados en Cuba, la noticia de su fallecimiento, el enlace de su muerte con el hecho de que solo unos pocos días antes de morir él había firmado una carta que el gobierno cubano distribuyó por el mundo tratando de negar y apoyándose en la lista de los intelectuales y escritores que firmaban esa carta la idea de que en Cuba hubiese alguna represión. Como todos ustedes probablemente saben, el 11 de julio de 2021 fue un día muy complicado para la historia cubana. A partir de una serie de presiones, tanto internas como externas, hubo manifestaciones populares en todo el país que tomaron las calles de distintas ciudades y que provocaron un movimiento rápido por parte de las fuerzas gubernamentales en las cuales se trató por todos los medios de coartar que esa manifestación tuviera un carácter aún mayor de la que tuvo. Hubo violencia, hubo golpes, hubo incomodidad, hubo un malestar que dura hasta el día de hoy y que ha tenido sus secuelas en el éxodo que ahora mismo está viviendo Cuba, cuando tras abrirse los aeropuertos, habiendo finalizado la peor etapa de la pandemia, muchos cubanos y cubanas decidieron salir a cualquier destino posible para dejar atrás un país en el cual definitivamente las cosas se han puesto mucho más difíciles. Por supuesto, si eso ocurre para una población que todavía se sigue creyendo más blanca que mestiza, imaginemos qué puede pasar para el cuerpo de los afrodescendientes. En esos días hubo también un determinado tipo de anhelo por controlar las voces de lo que jóvenes escritores, artistas e intelectuales estaban promoviendo durante esas manifestaciones. Varios de ellos son negros o mestizos. Pienso, por ejemplo, en Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, que se ha convertido en una figura muy reconocible dentro de toda esta incomodidad, junto a otros, como el dramaturgo cubano Junior García, que tuvo que tomar el camino del exilio. Hoy, Junior vive en España, Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara sigue prisionero en Cuba, lo cual nos hizo pensar a varios de los que, una vez que pasó la resaca de estos acontecimientos, en el destino posible que esa revolución, cuando era discutida, elegía para cuerpos marcados por el color de la piel. Los blancos pueden exiliarse, los negros terminan presos. De alguna manera eso repite las preguntas que Zurbano hacía en aquel artículo del New York Times y me hizo pensar también, por supuesto, en la figura de un intelectual tan importante como Walterio Carbonell, una de las figuras fundamentales del pensamiento de los afrodescendientes en Cuba y que en una fecha tan temprana como 1961, tras haber publicado su ensayo Cómo surgió la cultura nacional, terminó siendo desaparecido también de la cultura oficial cubana. Hay entonces una cronología de cuerpos, de nombres, de pensamientos, que así como se integran en el proceso de la revolución, una vez que la discuten, también entran en una zona problemática. Pienso en Walterio, que pasó por ese proceso, y al que recuerdo como un hombre lamentablemente enloquecido, caminando por los pasillos de la Biblioteca Nacional, encargado él mismo de llevar en su cuerpo y en su piel negra todos los avatares de ese tipo de pensamiento y las consecuencias que podía tener siendo un hombre negro al discutir un determinado tipo de punto de vista de la revolución. Pienso en los años en que pasó Eugenio Hernández Espinosa sin poder estrenar ni escribir después de haber estrenado María Antonia, que como digo, es hoy un clásico del teatro cubano. Pienso en su firma, en esa carta que evidentemente demostró que ciertas crisis y el manejo de ciertos nombres sigue siendo un arma desde la cual la revolución quiere no responder a las preguntas que seguía haciendo Roberto Zurbano en el New York Times hace hoy 10 años. Pienso en Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara o pienso en cómo un artista negro del performance, Carlos Martiel, hoy por hoy sigue incorporando esos grandes cuestionamientos que vienen desde los años de la esclavitud en Cuba, pero que siguen poniendo en una situación problemática al ojo del blanco, al ojo del mestizo y al ojo del propio negro cuando piensa en el asunto de estas preguntas en una Cuba que sigue siendo un work in progress. El arte debería servir para replantearnos todas estas cuestiones, para colocar los cuerpos en un orden de lectura en el cual nos digan otras palabras, se exija un nuevo vocabulario en términos de libertad y en términos también de autonomía. Solo en el 2019 en Cuba, vino a implementarse el Programa Nacional contra el Racismo y la Discriminación Racial. Esto ha pasado poco antes de la pandemia y, por lo tanto, como pueden imaginar, las propuestas de este programa nacional aprobado por el gobierno, que tiene la bendición de la nueva administración política de Cuba, no ha podido trabajar en la dimensión en la que se esperaba. Y es un programa que por ahora se ha preocupado por recoger este tipo de incomodidades, de preguntas, de resquemores que vienen con respecto a la presencia de los afrodescendientes en Cuba, sin poder todavía dar las respuestas contundentes que deberían esperarse ya. Esta Cuba, de la que vengo ahora, en la que estoy viviendo, evidentemente tiene que replantear una serie de basamentos sobre los cuales durante muchos años alzamos la utopía de la revolución. Ahora bien, ¿esa es una utopía válida? ¿Es una utopía viva? ¿Es una utopía blanca? ¿Es una utopía negra? ¿Es una utopía mestiza? Son preguntas que entran dentro de un canal de diálogo en el cual, al parecer, por lo menos han empezado a erigir determinadas manos y determinadas voces para opinar sobre esa cuestión, pero también es una Cuba que necesita ser reseteada a toda velocidad a fin de ponerse en sintonía con lo que el mundo espera, no solo de Cuba, sino espera también de una postura mucho más abierta, mucho más estremecedora y vibrante en ese sentido. Pensar Cuba sin pensar lo negro es imposible. Yo creo que a partir de esa voluntad, grandes intelectuales, grandes figuras de la cultura cubana trabajaron, no solo Walterio Carbonell, Nicolás Guillén, Rómulo Lachatañeré, incluso figuras, por supuesto, que venían de una tradición de sangre aparentemente blanca. Sin Lidia Cabrera no podemos pensar a Cuba, y todavía Lidia Cabrera sigue siendo un problema y un tabú para la sociedad cubana. Pienso hoy fundamentalmente en cómo la cultura cubana ha representado o no al negro, a la mujer negra, al mestizo, al mulato, y cómo se asume o no en una condición en la cual la idea del mestizaje debe significar también un cimarronaje de ideas que todavía no está del todo visible, aunque Cuba siga siendo todavía, para bien de Lidia Cabrera, mucho monte por abrir. En ese territorio es que estamos pensando en Cuba hoy todas estas cuestiones, y quiero desde aquí mandar a Roberto Zurbano, mi gran amigo, a 10 años de ese gran problema, el mismo abrazo que le hubiera dado siempre y en cualquier momento. Muchas gracias.
Gracias por compartir esas palabras bien impactantes, y pues yo voy a empezar con unas preguntas y luego voy a abrir por el público. Muchos de ustedes, cada uno, hablaron de prácticas o ambientes o culturas o el proceso de reconectar, de reclamar, de cambiar y darnos cuenta de qué es una presencia africana en nuestro ser, en nuestras comunidades y también trabajo. ¿Pueden hablar un poco más de qué prácticas, también ambientes o espacios que han permitido a ustedes que su trabajo sea fiel testimonios de sus raíces africanas?
Repita.
Sorry. So pretty much just like what spaces, what practices, what environments have influenced and inspired your work to be a faithful witness to your African roots, your Afro-Puerto Rican roots?
That was the part, the faithful witness part. Again, I want to pay tribute to the Nuyorican writers and Black writers of the Black arts movement, and for me, those spaces were, well, first the library. Libraries are very important, and finding the books, finding For Colored Girls Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, by Ntozake Shange, which is a choral poem about Black girls, about the spectrum of Blackness. And in her work, and this is an African American woman, I saw Spanglish in her work, and I saw references to the Bronx, to Southern Boulevard, to the Hunts Point Palace, to Willie Colon. And that was important to find that space, the space on the page. And we're talking about palabras y la literatura. También los espacios para mí fue el Nuyorican Poets Café, performances in different places, performance spaces in the Bronx, like the Point Community Development Corporation, who has a theater called Live from the Edge Theater in Hunts Point in the South Bronx. En La Marqueta, yo tengo una serie de poesía, un micrófono abierto que se llama Barrio Poetics, en La Marqueta Retoña, in el barrio in East Harlem on 115th and Park Avenue, and also in the classroom where I teach.
Bueno, espacios. Como he dicho antes, hay tres palabras que para mí son muy importantes en todo este proceso, que es una es como reconocimiento, lucha y resistencia, ¿no? En este proceso de reconocimiento, de decir qué es lo africano, qué es lo que me vincula a África, y por ende superar la construcción en sí misma de lo que significa África y africano, yo creo que una de las cosas que a mí me han hecho entrar mucho en contacto, o sea, con esta idea de salir de mi propio conocimiento, por alguna forma, ¿no? de haber crecido y nacido en un país, España como tal, y acercarme a algo que para mí era externo, que era muy cercano, por venir de una familia, que mis padres eran de Guinea Ecuatorial, es volver a Guinea. Yo digo volver, nunca fui, pero me fui a Guinea y para mí el contacto con lo africano, con lo guineano y específicamente con lo inué, partía sobre todo de conocer la lengua. Porque a mí la lengua me abrió consideraciones completamente diferentes, ¿no? Desde lo que significa ser hombre, lo que significa ser mujer, lo que significa el espacio, el entorno. Por ejemplo, hay muchas palabras que traducidas directamente al español no tienen ningún significado. Es como la palabra mutema. En los indogües es un pueblo que vivía siempre cerca del mar, ¿no? Y mutema era como la línea del horizonte del mar, ¿no? Entonces, mutema, con la llegada de los españoles, mutema se convirtió en España. El horizonte era España, y lo que iba mucho más allá de lo que ellos podían ver era España, ¿no? O sea, la reconexión se cambió completamente, pero originariamente mutema, si pudiese traducirse, significaba más allá, ¿no? Entonces, había un límite físico, un límite espiritual, que era como el más allá, donde estaba lo desconocido, donde no se podía saber qué es lo que había. Pero a su vez, mutema está relacionado con mulema o molema, dependiendo de la... porque hay diferentes dialectos, mutema, mulema, que significa corazón. Y de alguna forma esas dos palabras juegan entre ellas. Mutema, mulema, con el límite del conocimiento, y el corazón son dos cosas que están unidas a la vez, ¿no? Y después hay otras palabras, como por ejemplo mayoca. Mayoca significa, desde lo español sería como jugar, pero también significa bailar. Jugar y bailar significa lo mismo. Lo que quiere decir que antiguamente no había juegos, lo que había eran ritos. El juego y el baile era lo mismo, eran los ritos, eran las tradiciones, que de forma peyorativa, con el contacto con los españoles, se ha convertido en juego. Pero en realidad el juego es la tradición y es el poder enigmático de la esencia del espiritual, ¿no? Del trascender espiritual, ¿no? Del cuerpo. Entonces, para mí, acercándome a todas estas consideraciones, viendo la ambivalencia, el juego perverso que supuso el contacto con los españoles y tal, lo que yo creo que a mí en este espacio de realización me ha supuesto ser, considerarme como africano, sobre todo entrar en contacto con el africano, es trascender mi individualidad, trascender mis límites, trascender mi consideración como individuo y llegar a un espacio más espiritual donde se juegan con fuerzas, voy a decir, religiosas, incluso con Dios. Es donde yo ahí me ubico para intentar conectar con todo aquello que considero africano.
En el caso de Cuba, como dije, todo este asunto está todavía colocado en términos de interrogantes. Yo creo que eso es una ventaja que podríamos aprovechar mejor. O sea, realmente cómo colocar este ámbito de independencia, libertad y sobre todo de visibilización de una serie de elementos que en nuestra historia y nuestra propia cultura aún necesitan ser rescatados. Yo creo que todavía hay un largo proceso en el cual deberíamos ser capaces de recolocar en nuestra tradición nombres y voces que han sido fundamentales y que desde el espacio de la comunidad afrodescendiente han aportado a Cuba una serie de elementos no solo folclóricos, no solo externos, no solo relacionados con el mundo del baile, el color y la alegría, sino también con la parte que también nos toca de la tragedia nacional que Cuba ha vivido y que han sido en no pocas ocasiones silenciados justamente porque son voces que molestan. Y yo creo que mi sentido de participación ahora mismo en esta temática está ubicado justo en el interés por el regreso de esas figuras, por la reaparición de esas figuras. Hay voces en Cuba que son muy respetadas en este ámbito. Pienso, por ejemplo, en Lázara Menéndez o en Tomás Fernández Robaina. Son dos personas a las cuales cada vez que me encuentro con ellos asisto de alguna manera a una lección en este territorio y de las cuales sigo aprendiendo. Hace varios años, en el 2002, dedicamos en la revista Extramuros, donde yo trabajaba en ese momento, un número a Lidia Cabrera, y yo fui uno de los gestores del número. Y de repente hubo personas que me preguntaron, bueno, ¿y por qué tú, si no eres creyente, si no participas de estas religiones, si no conoces estos mitos a fondo, te interesas en Lidia Cabrera? Y digo, bueno, porque forma parte de mi cultura, porque tropiezo con símbolos de lo que ella dejó y de lo que ella aportó como una mujer que problematizó todas estas presencias y todos estos espacios y que logró, siendo una mujer blanca, aristocrática, lesbiana, entrar en territorios donde ni siquiera los hombres que estaban investigando en ese territorio pudieron entrar. Ella es una transgresora. Y yo creo que de un modo fundamental lo que debemos señalar en varias de las figuras blancas o negras que han entrado en este campo de discusión es el carácter de transgresión que ellos incorporaron, que trajeron a la cultura cubana, que siguen representando dentro de ella y que por eso siguen siendo muy incómodos a veces por regresar. Lo negro sigue siendo un tema tabú en varias circunstancias. El terror hacia lo negro sigue presente en determinadas zonas de la cultura cubana. No es que no hayamos avanzado en ese territorio, pero sí hay que pensarlo como un problema en el cual la posición pasiva de lectura o de recepción de lo que ello implica no nos va a llevar a ningún lugar. Hay que asumirlo sencillamente como eso, como una voluntad. Y cuando hice la versión teatral para títeres y público adulto, ahora que estamos hablando del Día del Títere y de la poesía, de la gran novela cubana del siglo XIX, Cecilia Valdés, titulada La Virgencita de Bronce, con Teatro de las Estaciones en Cuba, tuve que repensar mucho de esos caracteres, de cómo representábamos lo negro, cómo abordar ese fenómeno y sobre todo lo que implica aún hoy en el imaginario cubano esta novela que está basada sobre el asunto de la purificación de la sangre. O sea, Cecilia Valdés, la mulata mítica de la novela cubana, de la cultura cubana, lo que quiere es ascender la sociedad y lamentablemente está enamorada de su propio hermanastro, que es el resultado de un incesto, en fin. Y al representar eso, tuve que pasar por Cirilo Villaverde, tuve que pasar por Abelardo Estorino, tuve que pasar por Reinaldo Arenas, que son figuras que han trabajado sobre el mito de la mulata, pero también tuve que pasar por la representación de todo ese mito en el teatro cubano, en el cine cubano, en la música cubana, donde el espacio de lo negro es fundamental, y repensar eso en función de libertades, no de restricciones. Cómo traer al presente ese problema, cómo hablar de ese asunto desde el teatro de títeres, que tiene una dramaturgia propia, que tiene un público que va a verlo con determinado tipo de recelo con respecto a si es un teatro menor o no, correspondiendo a la imagen que tenemos del teatro dramático, hecho por actores vivos, etc. Y al mismo tiempo volver a hablar de lo cubano desde ahí, volver a poner lo cubano en esa circunstancia. Y hay una línea, perdón que me cite, de esa obra, de esa versión, que me gusta mucho, en que un personaje le dice a Cecilia: tu sangre no es roja, ni azul, ni blanca, es negra. A partir de ahí empieza para el personaje un proceso de acomodamiento de su identidad, replanteo de su identidad, sobre el cual la tragedia que el personaje vive va a tener en términos teatrales otras consecuencias. O sea, a partir de todos esos encontronazos que nos damos en la vida, volvemos una y otra vez a pensar en la pregunta sobre lo negro, en la pregunta sobre lo mestizo, en la pregunta sobre la identidad, que yo creo que para Cuba sigue siendo una pregunta urgente y pendiente.
Gracias. Es importante de reconocer y también de los lugares y procesos fisicales también espirituales y orales y en recuperar esos voces, esos idiomas, esas prácticas es parte de ver en papel, de ver en persona, de ver en cosas, prácticas espirituales, de reclamar. Y quiero expandir un poco más de ese proceso de recuperar el voz, el poder, la idioma. Esto es ser en los trabajos africanos y como todos nosotros hemos hablado, porque yo soy mis padres son de Liberia. Yo nací en los Estados Unidos. Igualmente tenemos que traducir ese proceso de afrodescendencia en toda parte del mundo. En esa reconexión, ¿cómo ustedes, porque mencionó a Mariposa, como you had to reclaim pelo malo, pelo vivo, you had to be able to reclamar esas palabras de español también, idioma, y también eso pasó en el país de mi familia. No había un idioma por comprar tierra, ¿verdad? So gente, they thought that they were aspirando. So esos procesos de palabras también de identidad nos impactan nuestro trabajo. Por mi última pregunta por el día de hoy, luego paso al público, puede hablar de esa reconexión y reclamación de idiomas indígenas y africanos. Y también igual español también.
I was so into what you were saying about your family. So, the question again?
Just talk about reclaim, because I know you worked and you mentioned being in Spanish and also just having
The reclaiming.
evolution of your identity, being able to say, I wrote something now, but a few days later, once you had that reconnection, you were able to evolve the word. So just talk about that process of reclaiming the words that you once thought that you rejected.
Well, my name is Mariposa for a reason. Mi nombre de pila es María Teresa. Mariposa es mi nombre de la literatura. And I feel like it's a process. It is still, I am still reclaiming. I am still evolving. And I loved the image of the horizon, la línea horizonte, because we're still growing, and that's what consciousness, a levantar la conciencia, the development of our political consciousness, and it's bigger than my reclaiming, because I'm witnessing my students who are reclaiming and forming their understanding of their social condition. And so writing and reading reading my contemporaries, reading our forebears, helps me. I think about Tato Laviera, Luis Reyes Rivera. These are the Nuyorican, the founders of the Nuyorican movement. And Luis Reyes Rivera, who was never claimed, he never felt claimed by Puerto Rico. In fact, I don't think he was ever invited to recite his poetry here. He was known as the janitor of history. He called himself the janitor of history. And he read mostly with African-American poets and writers. He was from Brooklyn, and he should be studied. It's very important that his work be included. And I hope that in the courses here of Nuyorican literature that his work is included. He would always say that all black letters is existentialism, because we are writing of our existence, and we still live in a day and age where we have to fight and affirm our existence and affirm that we are human beings. We are under attack. And it's not only in the United States, but the reactionary right, it seems that the more liberated we become, the oppressor evolves and it takes a different form. And so I want to just speak about the book banning that's happening, especially in the state of Florida, where we are hearing about Roberto Clemente being removed from the curriculum. They don't want us to have our heroes. They don't want us to have pride. So do we dare to be free? Our reclaiming, my reclaiming, is about daring to be free, to say we are gonna fight back and that we're not going down.
Para mí, todo esto es un proceso que implica legitimidad, ¿no? Desde dónde yo hablo y por qué. Porque desde la cultura que pertenecen mis padres, yo, para muchos, no soy hindúe, soy un híbrido, y entonces mi legitimidad para hablar de la cultura hindúe está siempre en entredicho, ¿no? Lo cual para mí ya no es problemático, o sea, para mí está bien, porque entiendo un principio dentro de todo esto, ¿no? La implicación y la identificación que tienes que tener con una comunidad, en este caso la hindúe, no te hace de facto el hecho de ser parte de la comunidad simplemente por el mero hecho de nacer, sino por el mero hecho también de implicarte o estar en ciertos círculos, ¿no? Incluso sincréticos de la sociedad. Por lo tanto, yo no formo parte de eso, yo no soy hindúe. Estoy de acuerdo, ¿no? Pero también entiendo que los tiempos o los momentos también están marcados, pues, por aquellas personas que también toman el relevo, ¿no? Y siempre creo que esta ha sido una dinámica que ha estado marcada en la cultura hindúe, como en otro tipo de culturas africanas, donde los secretos, donde el conocimiento de la sociedad siempre ha estado de una forma un poco velada, y para una parte o para algunos, y donde al final y al cabo el camino del trascender de esa identidad ha quedado siempre en manos de aquellos que, bueno, han querido ejercer por estar simplemente, y porque como tal se identificaban como tal, ¿no? Entonces yo me identifico como hindúe, aunque me nieguen como hindúe, lo cual no supone un conflicto, y creo que esa negación y esa afirmación es positiva para mí, para mi propio desarrollo, atender a que hay partes de mí que no están implicadas conscientemente o voluntariamente, o no he querido implicarme, o circunstancialmente, pero también tengo la implicación en sí mismo que la parte que me toca, la pequeña parte que a mí me puede tocar, dejando de lado el reconocimiento, no el reconocimiento de lo que implica formar parte de la comunidad hindúe o de la cultura hindúe, la tomo por mí mismo, ¿no? Y decido en ese momento, como decía antes, cuál es la continuidad de lo que yo quiero dar, ¿no? a ese saber ancestral, ¿no? Como esas pequeñas palabras que yo he ido diciendo aquí, ¿no? Recolectando, porque yo no hablo la lengua, que es un gran hándicap también, pero también he entendido que no necesito hablarlo, no porque deba o no, preferiría hablarla, pero ya que sea el caso que no la sé, pues bueno, no necesito hablarla para también construirme sobre la base de aquellas cosas que yo pueda entender mínimamente, sobre las que poder indagar y sobre las que poder plantear un camino que al final y al cabo será una aportación en el tiempo, y que en la confianza que yo creo que existe cuando te edificas con un grupo, te edificas con unas personas y estáis alineados, creo que todos estamos remando sobre la misma dirección y cada uno pondrá lo suyo por su parte, ¿no? De alguna forma, aunque no estemos conectados o no sepamos que uno está trabajando en algo aquí o el otro allá. Creo que esa conciencia de colectividad, donde está instituida, aúna esfuerzos de forma silenciosa, y que es importante, sobre todo, tener la legitimidad, porque yo creo que, por lo menos en mi caso, ha habido un proceso constantemente de decirme que no soy legítimo para hablar, o no soy legítimo para estar, o no formo parte de esto, no formo parte de lo otro, y eso es una forma de acallar voces, acallar conciencias, y sobre todo decir excluir, ¿no? Y eso también sucede en África, ¿no? También existe eso, hay que tener valentía para legitimarse y decir, yo estoy aquí y esta es mi aportación, entendiendo el momento, el lugar por lo que estás comprometido y también, no sé, lo que se quiere, sobre todo dar continuidad, porque a veces uno puede observar la cultura africana como una especie de algo arqueológico que está ahí para observarse con cierta pulcritud, ¿no? Yo creo que la creatividad es el contacto más excelso para dar continuidad a las cosas, ¿no? La creatividad no es simplemente un entretenimiento, la creatividad también tiene un contacto con el más allá, ¿no? Y creo que en el momento que te reconoces con esos vínculos, como decíamos, un poco espirituales, el momento que reconoces que tus ancestros están presentes, existe un vínculo que te va transformando en tu conciencia y en tu forma de actuar y en tu forma de entender las cosas. Entonces, yo intento trabajar.
Volviendo a la figura de Roberto Zurbano, en una entrevista de hace algunos meses o no mucho más, Alberto Abreu, que es un importante también investigador del tema en Cuba y que sostiene su blog Afromodernidades como un espacio donde aparecen textos y reseñas que abordan estos asuntos. Zurbano hablaba en una entrevista que le hacía Alberto sobre el concepto de neorracismo, que es algo que aparece de pronto en la conversación de algunos de los especialistas que rondan este campo para definir la circunstancia en la que viven los cuerpos afrodescendientes en una Cuba donde violentamente ha cambiado la economía, donde violentamente han desaparecido algunos de los estamentos que habían levantado ese edificio como un espacio mucho más ideal y aparentemente mucho más inclusivo, cuando realmente no era así. En Cuba se empiezan a romper algunas de esas barreras para demostrar que las voces de las minorías, que las voces de determinadas comunidades, que incluso las voces de determinados gremios son importantes para construir algo que no es solamente la gran historia, no la épica en la que Cuba ha sostenido gran parte de su idea, sino la historia cotidiana, los pequeños fragmentos de vida que poco a poco van haciendo la historia. Ahora, justamente después de los acontecimientos del 11 de julio, el gobierno cubano se ha preocupado por responder a demandas que durante años ya se habían acumulado en barrios vulnerables, que es como se le llama a las zonas periféricas, y la visita de los funcionarios del gobierno, del propio presidente del país, ha demostrado que durante mucho tiempo se abandonó parte de esos territorios donde la gente vive en condiciones que en algunos casos están más cercanas al ideal de vida que pudimos tener hace 20, 30 años en Cuba y en otros a la pobreza. Hay comunidades que todavía mantienen ritos, ideas, ideologías, imaginarios que tienen que ver, por supuesto, con la herencia africana y recuerdo cómo no hace mucho vimos en una imagen en la televisión a una santera presentándole sus santos al presidente del país y pidiéndole que nos bendiga, que nos ayude a todos para salir de esta gran crisis, cosa completamente impensable en la Cuba de los 60 o de los 70 sobre todo, cuando la ideología importada desde Rusia dejó una huella muy fuerte en el imaginario político, ideológico, cultural y de cualquier carácter en nuestro país. Hoy por hoy, presentar esa pregunta acerca del neorracismo nos implica también un acto de compromiso, nos implica realmente preguntarnos si ese neorracismo, que todavía es un término en discusión entre los propios investigadores que hablan de afromodernidades en Cuba, es real, es palpable y sobre todo cómo se vive. Pero en esta nueva Cuba, donde el dinero ha empezado a tener un valor que antes no era tan importante, pero que ahora lo define absolutamente todo. Antiguamente hablamos de ideología o política, ahora hablamos de economía y política para definir lo que pasa en Cuba, porque la economía también está dictando políticas en Cuba de exclusión, y en efecto vemos cómo de pronto los nuevos dueños de pequeños negocios están pidiendo trabajadores de determinada edad, de determinada raza, de determinado tipo de formación universitaria o estudiantil para ser aceptados o no como trabajadores de sus nuevos negocios en Cuba. Y eso, por supuesto, empieza a ser una línea de exclusión donde los negros y los mestizos no siempre están representados. La claridad de ese término, neorracismo, implica una nueva batalla, un nuevo sentido de cómo enfrentar esta posición y, lamentablemente, desde las posturas oficiales, aparentemente ese es un problema que no entra todavía en las discusiones que estamos teniendo sobre el asunto en Cuba, aunque durante este proceso, como digo, se ha demostrado que en efecto sí hay personas que viven dentro de un carácter donde esa idea del neorracismo, si no viable como un concepto para aplicarlo a todo lo que estamos viviendo en Cuba, sí por lo menos está demostrando que hay síntomas de un dolor, de una preocupación que debe ser atendida y en las cuales desde la cultura y desde el pensamiento, no solo desde el Estado y las posiciones oficiales, también deberíamos influir. para cubrir esos espacios, para escuchar esas voces y sobre todo para recuperar voces que se han ido perdiendo en todo este proceso.
Un aplauso de verdad por la panelista, gracias por compartir esas respuestas y estar con nosotros. Se acabó el tiempo, yo creo que estaré preparando por el próximo panel, pero yo creo que si hay preguntas pueden conocerlo afuera, estamos aquí por la semana, de verdad, de todas las experiencias que han compartido, de todo el trabajo que están haciendo. Gracias, espero que podamos seguir apoyando, escuchando y dando un foro de todo el conocimiento de Cuba, de Guinea Ecuatorial y también de la diáspora. So, gracias por estar aquí. Bye.
Ok, Who's presenting first? Okay. Él no tiene presentación. No. No. Sip, sip.
So good morning, everybody. I want to preface this panel by stating that it's going to be in English. And, you know, I'm not an interpreter, but certainly we could clarify anything in Q&A if need be. So for those who may not know me, my name is Pedro Lebron Ortiz. I'm a former mechanic, philosopher, and I make my living as an engineer. This morning, I have the absolute honor and privilege of sitting with two outstanding thinkers whose works have been incredibly influential for me over the past few years. The title of this panel is Memoria de la Violencia y Masculinidades. The topic for today is to think about the particularities of black men or racially subjugated men in general in relation to white supremacy, empire, racial capitalism, and so forth. Our speakers will be thinking about the question of black masculinity from the perspective of black male studies and the insights gleaned from that field of study and questions of cognition and subjectivity in relation to the black male subject. I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of our speakers before handing over the mic. The format is going to be a typical format. Each speaker will do like 10 to 20 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A until 11:20. I do want to ask that any question or comment be, concise, so everybody that, wants to ask a question, make a comment, has the opportunity to do so. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Tommy J. Curry. Dr. Curry is an African-American scholar, author, and professor of philosophy who also holds a master's in public health. As of 2019, he holds a personal chair in Africana philosophy and black male studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. His research interests are in Africana philosophy and the black radical tradition. His areas of specialization are 19th century ethnology, critical race theory, social political theory, and black male studies. He is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, published with Temple University Press in 2017, which won the 2018 American Book Award. He is the author of Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for a Philosophy of Racial Empire, published by SUNY Press in 2018, and has republished the forgotten philosophical works of William Ferris as a philosophical treatise of William H. Ferris, selected readings from the African Abroad or His Evolution in Western Civilization, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2016. He is also the editor of the first book series dedicated to the study of black males, entitled Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males, on Temple University Press. Dr. Curry is currently co-editing with Danae Evans the forthcoming anthology, Contemporary African American Philosophy, Where Do We Go From Here, on Bloomsbury Publishing, slated to come out, I think, later this year. His research has been recognized by Diverse as placing him among the top 15 emerging scholars in the United States in 2018, and his public intellectual work earned him a Society for the Advancement of American Philosophies and Lane Locke Award in 2017. He is a past recipient of the USC Show Foundation and A.I. Mene Shep's Foundation Teaching Fellowship in 2017, and the past president of the Philosophy Born of Struggle, one of the oldest black philosophy organizations in the United States. Unfortunately, our second speaker couldn't make it out. I'm going to present them anyway in case folks want to check out their work. Dr. Anwar Uhuru is an assistant professor of African American Studies and affiliate faculty in the departments of philosophy and gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Wayne State University. Their research focuses on human value on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, and ableism. They have publications in the Journal of Hip Hop Studies, the APA newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience, and Radical Philosophy Review. Their forthcoming book, The Insurrectionist Case for Reparations, Race, Value, and Ethics, will be published through SUNY Press. Last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Michael Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer is an associate professor of English. His work focuses on the revolutionary potentiality of Black people and takes a multidisciplinary approach to exploring the works that authorize, accompany, sustain, and depict Black being. Michael has published 2 monographs, An Africana Philosophy, Temporality, Homo Liminalis, published by Palgrave in 2018, and Black Minded, The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X, published by Pluto in 2020. He is currently working on 3 new book projects. The first, The Door of No Return, Being as Black, endeavors to articulate a theory of the Black subject that reaches beyond the limitations of the notion of anti-Blackness as an irreducible and omnipresent feature of the world as we know it. The second, Ramifications of Ramifications, a hermeneutics of Toni Morrison, is preoccupied with the oeuvre of the Nobel laureate, presupposing that the author is engaged in a long philosophical meditation on the nature of Blackness. The third project is a trade book that is entitled Sir Lewis Hamilton, Maybe It's Because I'm Black. The book examines the activism of 7-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton's activism with respect to police violence and diversity and equity in motorsport as a vehicle for thinking about a new form of radical Black cosmopolitanism that is exemplified by the example of Hamilton, who happens to be the only Black person in the history of Formula One. Additionally, Michael recently debuted a sonic assemblage composed with Grammy Award-winning multi-instrumentalist Nicholas Payton at the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center, entitled Reclaiming 8 minutes and 46 seconds of Juju, that explores the sound space of police violence through the vehicle of the blues. For the 2022-2023 academic year, Professor Sawyer is a visiting scholar in the Humanities Institute at Penn State University. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Curry. You gotta put in Zemo or something like that? I don't know if it's right now, so. Where's the, let me go find somebody. All right. Working out, it came up, but yeah, no, it just went off. Yeah, that's fake. No. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I want to just do it for the person talking.
It's not going from the computer to the, so that they hook it up.
Has to go to this thing?
Yeah.
PC currently selected.
Your HDMI. Did they disconnect it?
I don't know, but they got it hooked up here. I don't know what the, oh, they got the HDMI there.
Yeah. Nope. No, it's just pulls up. No, no problem. There it goes. I got it. All right. Thank you very much. So as you heard, my name is Professor Tommy Curry, professor at the University of Edinburgh. And my research has really looked at the process of racialized men and boys across the world and how racialization impacts and denatures what we take to be or traditionally associated with male privilege or the idea of patriarchy. So most of our theories concerning how we look at black men and boys stem from a pathological orientation which assume that they always exist in excess. Now, this is not only a sociological and historical verifiable aspect of how we study black male pathology, but it also affects our conceptualization because our normative concepts of how we think about black men as subjects tend towards the pathological and then use other identities to decrease that kind of pathological nature. So an example of that would be to say something like black men have toxic masculinity, and then black men, as they become more pluralized in identity, more feminine, more gay, queer, etc., we think that that tendency lessens. So black men then are always negated within the process of conceptualization. What this presentation aims to show you is various aspects of theorization and some of the genealogy of the concepts that black male studies actually tries to challenge. So what we find in the intellectual trajectory of how we study racialized men and boys, specifically black men and boys, is that we try to disown these kind of racist caricatures of black males. So if you say something like black men are rapists, etc., we want to challenge that as racism, but at the same time, we reestablish that through gender theory to say, oh, they're toxic, they're patriarchal, etc. So there's a redundancy, repetition and replication of toxic and pathological characters of racialized men that exist in a characterological fallacy, where we can we challenge a racist stereotype but replace it with a gendered analysis. So one of the things that I think floats around the internet quite often about what I said is that while we may disown the racist caricature of black men and boys as super predators, we simultaneously imagine them as voids, vacuous figures that we're fine not knowing. We do not care about how they suffer during their lives, but love to perform outrage at their deaths. So what we have is a development of black masculinity theory over the last 200 years that establishes black men and boys largely as creatures of want. So even when we go back to the 1860s, where you get post-bellum ethnologists debating what black men would be, because now that they've moved from a stage of slavery as animals and mere chattel to what do we think of as a black man who is free from chains, you get the idea that they were rapists and beasts. Now, we know the idea and the myth of the black rapist, but what people often don't understand was that this was not a racist caricature that was centrally introduced as propaganda. This was the accumulation of decades and decades of scientific research that linked black men's sexual behavior to that of other animals. So they would literally measure, or they would theorize, conceptualize how black men's sexual activity mimicked wild animals rather than that of the white male human being. So it's important to understand that when we talk about post-bellum ethnology, we're looking at the effect that Darwinism and evolutionary thought had on the description and debates and conceptualization of races around the world, that black men were at the central of that. Ethnology was a science of race that utilized men as the barometer to judge how races were developed. Now, when you move to the Reconstruction period in the early 20th century, you have to understand that gender theory foundationalized by ethnologists was used by suffragettes. So what we often do is we say, oh, suffragettes were challenging patriarchy, so men became a subject of study. That's not true. Suffragettes reproduced what ethnologists said and utilized the idea that black men were lowly savages that were not more intelligent than white women to justify their claim of why white women should have the ballot and rule over them. This meant that white women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Phoebe Cousins, Charlotte Gilman all participated in developing and popularizing ethnological science and tropes about how black men were actually the enemies of women. They were misogynistic, they were abusers, etc. Now, this idea carried forward 200 years and actually would be one of the central pillars of subcultural violence theory, which we'll get to in a moment. Into the early 20th century, sexologists argued that black males were apatriarchal and savage. What they meant by apatriarchal was that black men could not establish households. They could not be fathers, leaders, politicians, statesmen. These were all aspects of early 20th century ethnology and social science that meant that black men, specifically black families, could not serve as the basis and structure of the society's homes or government. In the early 20th century, black men were actually depicted as lesser men prone to deviance and female personality disorders. Now, because we often don't do research into how we think about contemporary black masculinity theory, what we often don't understand is that hypermasculinity during this period of time was introduced as a way to talk about black men internalizing female personality misidentification. Because black households were apatriarchal and black men were absent from that, black males, black boys didn't have strong father role models. That meant that they were raised by their mothers. The idea that they would internalize female personalities, female love, female sentiment, meant that they became hypermasculine because they had to compensate for what was lacking. This is the basis of toxic masculinity, of what we talk about today. This is also the foundational premise of the idea of the Moynihan Report, the matriarchal family, as well as the idea of subcultural violence theory, which took off in the 1970s. In the 1970s, black men were thought to be culturally deficient, violent, and prone to intraracial rape. Subcultural violence theory served as the basis of gender studies in the United States in the early 1970s. So the ethnological caricatures that I just described show that throughout the 19th and early 20th century, it was predominantly science of racial origin. That was a scientific inquiry that would assess the evolutionary stage of the ends of the races, comparing the males of the white group to that of black and non-Western people. That the ethnological research was then picked up by white pseudoscientists and feminists to depict black men as lesser males. And the idea of an apatriarchal black male was used to situate the failures of the black race from the 1900s forward to the 20th and 21st centuries. This meant that black males' reproductive capacity became the central idea, the central kind of phobia that white people focused on for over a century. The ability of black men to reproduce themselves, to reproduce pestilence, became the basis of how all white social scientific inquiry, from gender theory to sociology, anthropology, and of course backwards to ethnology, was situated. So that meant that racism then, or as black male studies scholars would say, racism is predominantly a misandric aggression. It is dedicated to limiting the reproductive and demographic capacities of a group to reproduce themselves, which is largely depicted by the understanding and role and place that their men have. In the 1970s, this was taken up as subcultural violence theory, which was offered by Wolfgang and Ferracuti in 1967. Now, subcultural violence theory is interesting because what it wanted to do was show that since black masculinity was not white masculinity, it was largely compensatory. What do we mean by that? Well, these ideas that suggest the things that we see all the time in bell hooks or even in intersectional theory that says that, well, because black men can't be patriarchs, they use violence, or they use abuse, or they use rape, or they use sexual assault, or hyperaggression to situate their manhood. That's a subcultural violence theory. Subcultural violence theory was the very first to introduce this idea of a compensatory masculinity where men who were outside the upper or middle classes and who were poor or not white utilize aggression and violence to substitute for the capital and civil gains that white men had within a patriarchal society. Ultimately, this thesis suggested that subcultures show that there are potent themes of violence in the cluster of values that make up the lifestyle, socialization process, and interpersonal relationships of individuals living in similar conditions. This means that when you look at racialized men historically, you're going to say that this group has a cluster of certain antisocial values. They're toxic, they're rapists, they believe in sexual assault, etc. These notions then kind of situate how we think about levels of intimate partner violence as well as intimate partner homicide. Remember, in 1967, they had not yet moved to the idea of sexual assault as rape as a way of characterizing black men. The reason for that was because you had the idea of the interracial rapist, the idea that black men raped white women. Subcultural violence theory was much more interested in the interracial tendencies. So as you can see here, when they were using Philadelphia as the measure of how they started to define certain racial tendencies or racial capacities, they suggested that, well, because black men were not men who could not lead households, black women then took on the dominant patriarchal role as head of household. Because black women did that according to their view, you can look at the variance between the kinds of homicide committed by white men and white women, compare that to black men and black women. And since black women had a higher rate of killing their spouses, they suggested here that because the Negro female both enjoys and suffers more of the male roles in the household as parental authority and supervisor. Is this imposed role that makes her more aggressive, more male-like, more likely, and more willing to respond violently, right? So you can see that the subculture violence theorists wanted to play with the idea of gender and sex roles to suggest that the racial element overturned what they thought of as the gender element in the white race. Said differently, in the white race, maleness and femaleness determines levels of violence. In the black race, the blackness determines the levels of violence. So within the idea of homicide, this was expanded by their student in 71 to talk about rape. The idea that black men use sexual assault and rape as a way to establish their masculinity was first introduced by Miniature Mimir in 1971. Now, Miniature Mimir wanted to argue that the Negro male's aggressive sexuality seemed to be more problematically due to the strong need to overcome problems of masculinity and sexual identity. This is so because the Negro family structure being mother-based, this is where the hypermasculinity idea comes from, and the need to overcome general societal disadvantage by substituting sexual aggressive masculinity for failures as a man in the economic and social scientific position. Now this of course leads us to the idea of a black male subculture. Now whereas other subcultures or other lower groups could be clustered, say, on the issue of poverty, black masculinity was thought to be a separate cluster of values. And this cluster of values suggested that, look, there's going to be characterized by black men being aggressive, having sexual exploits. Their views of masculinity are going to be judged by transitory relationships with women. And this all stems from the fact that they don't have patriarchal nuclear families. As such, sex and aggressive behavior becomes the main vehicle by which black men assert their worthiness. Now, the reason I'm giving you this kind of brief history is because I want you to start marrying this to what contemporary theories like intersectionality or even black feminism say about black men. So within the subculture violence theory, black men, or the black male rapists, became the basis of how you thought about black subculture. Now in this world, black women and black men both transmitted these pathological values. So this was not an issue of black masculinity, which is separate from the group. This is an issue of a racial cluster where all black people had these antisocial and sexually aggressive values. The women transmitted to the boys, and it constantly reproduced itself year after year. Now, compensatory masculinity, however, then became the central or the dominant feature of white academic sociology within the 1970s. We can see this in a few different ways. Of course, we can look at the criminological literature that's evidenced by people like Miniature Mimir and Lynn A. Curtis, but the subculture of violence theorists introduced the idea that black men were a uniquely violent racial subgroup that used interracial rape, sexual aggression, and violence as a definition of masculinity. This is the first time that we know in American social science that this was introduced as an explanatory mechanism of phenomena of the black male temperament. This means that black masculinity then became synonymous with this tendency because this was thought to be part of the ego and cultural development of how black men actually existed. Now, following the publication of Mimir's study, white criminologists started to focus on the threat that black males pose to women and children. This is a unique shift in the 1970s. So rather than thinking about the ability of black men to rape white women, there was this huge push by white feminists, white sociologists, and white criminologists to start thinking about the dynamics in which black men pose a threat to members of their own groups, specifically women and children. So compensatory masculinity and hypermasculinity separated black men from black women within the spheres of violence by making masculinity the cause or the central cause of all black pathology and deviance. Now, Lynn A. Curtis, who worked for the United States government and the U.S. Housing Authority, had a lot to say about this. And he wanted to introduce a contracultural model of subcultural interaction. What that means is, in a subculture theory of group interaction, you have group A, which is the dominant group, and group B. These two things have completely separate values. In a contracultural interaction, you have group A, which is the dominant group, and group B, which is the subgroup, but group A gives values to group B that they then distort. So in a contracultural model of sociological interaction, you're going to get white values that are then given to black people. An example would be patriarchy, but white people are going to use patriarchy as a paternalistic way to establish strong and hegemonic men that use property, wages, etc. to dictate policy and to dictate the world. Black men don't have that power, so they distort patriarchy and see it as a weapon of sexual aggression and violence, right? And this is exactly what this dynamic does. Contracultural theories or contracultural models of violence allow you to separate young, poor black males from the rest of the group. Because now, instead of it being a racial tendency where all black people have antisocial values, young, poor black men have the highest contracultural index, meaning they're more likely to kill, rape, murder, etc. And even though poor black females still have negative subcultural values, they're much lower. So this allowed black masculinity for the first time as a criminological site to be studied separately from the relationship that they share with black women and black children. Ultimately, this means, according to Lynn A. Curtis, that poor black men overindulged in white masculine practices. So utilizing the theory of compensatory masculinity, poor black men then had the highest level of subcultural orientation. Now this becomes important because what we're going to see in a little bit is that intraracial rape then became explained by this subcultural tendency. So whereas the subcultural violence theory said, hey, if you're black, you're going to have high levels of sexual aggression where women are going to pass that to the male. On the contracultural model, you're going to have, well, poor black women have completely different sets of values than poor black men do. Poor black men are rapists, poor black women are victims, right? So gender then becomes the dividing point between black men and black women in a contracultural orientation. And as such, that means that you have people like Lynn A. Curtis developing masculinity theory by arguing with white feminists like Susan Griffin, who were trying to explain how patriarchy actually causes rape and sexual violence, not only domestically, but internationally in terms of war. So feminist applications of subcultural violence theory were naturally applied to black men. The first person to do so was Susan A. Brown-Miller. So in her book, Against Our Will, she actually utilized the racist criminology of Wolfgang Farracuti and Menachem Amir to argue that poor black men were prone to rape and deviance. Now you can see this because she just flat out says it. She says that Wolfgang's theory, I'm going to oversimplify, is that within dominant value system or culture, there exists a subculture formed of those from lower classes, the poor, the disenfranchised, the black, whose values often run counter to those of the dominant culture, the people in charge. So the dominant culture can operate within laws of civility because it has little need to resort to violence to get what it wants. But the subculture, thwarted, inarticulate, and angry, is quick to resort to violence. Indeed, violence and physical aggression become a common way of life, particularly for young males. So feminist theory then jumps into the debate about the gender bifurcation between black men and black women and starts applying this as a general theory of poor black men. Because now that you're disadvantaged on gender, race, and class, you have to compensate. So sexual assault and rape become part and parcel of that kind of personality. So Brown-Miller then used subculture violence to link masculinity to sexual violence. Now remember, the only argument or the only evidence she uses is Wolfgang and Farracuti as well as Menachem Amir's work. Those research findings are only based on the study of Philadelphia and the kinds of violence that's perpetrated within that city. These are not universal findings. So ultimately, white feminists started to develop this more theoretically. Feminist theory determined that black males were actual rapists. Utilizing the work of Wolfgang Farracuti and Brown-Miller, you had two white women, Joyce E. Williams and Karen Holmes, who created a theory of racial sexual stratification. Now, racial sexual stratification serves as the basis of contemporary intersectionality theory. And in fact, if you go to the footnotes of Mapping the Margins by Kimberly Crenshaw, you will see her cite this text directly and in a favorable light to explain how rape is used to control and actually differentiate patterns of violence from black men and black women in the United States. According to Williams and Holmes, intraracial rape then becomes the basis of interpreting black male patriarchy. And this is a very, very important quote. This is something that Kimberly Crenshaw herself cites in that essay. Black females, in comparison to Anglo and Mexican Americans, were disproportionately victims of rape and are all too aware of their vulnerability. In the black community, tension and ambivalence surround the topic of rape, so the system of racial sexual stratification has assigned black females to be victims and black males to victimize. Black females are victimized in the convergence of racism and sexism by both black and white males. For black men, rape has been a tool of oppression, right? Where the couch in the myth of the black study, the black rapist, this discussion of blacks and their experience in relation to rape is intended to demonstrate that rape risks are inherent in the black experience. Kimberly Crenshaw cites this paragraph explicitly in Mapping the Margins. And the reason she does so is because what you're trying to show then is that violence or intraracial violence becomes the constitutive element of how you understand gender difference. So when we look at black men versus black women or any other group, if you look at black men and say these groups have higher or more toxic or violent behaviors, you then suggest that there's a fundamental and essential gender causal element. In other words, gender has a causal relationship to the kinds of disproportionate rates of violence we see men perpetrate compared to other groups like women, children, etc. Now, in this model, this also had the effect of universalizing the theory of patriarchy. Remember, within Western social science, the values between blacks and whites could not be shared. This is the whole point of the subculture violence theory. Group A does not have the same values as Group B. They're complete negations. So how then does patriarchy become something that all groups have? Well, within a racial sexual stratification system, which was introduced in the early 1980s, it's easy to explain. If you take a contracultural model of white male and white female relationships constituting the values that the society gets, and you disseminate that to the black community and to the Mexican American community, if if those two groups of men and women are lesser, less intelligent, more savage, more prone to violence, you can then say patriarchy creates the values, or the white community creates the values of patriarchy, but it's being distorted, inverted, made more violent, energized, etc., within these other ethnic spaces. As such, compensatory masculinity, or what black male studies scholars call mimesis, became the core assumption of gender studies in the 1970s. A few examples. William Holmes in 81 argues the male sex organ became the identity of the black male, as well as his tenuous link with life itself. For while he might be given approval for uninhibited sexual activity with black women, the least suggestion of sexual behavior with white women was to invite castration or death. Shulamith and Firestone, 1970, claimed the relationship between black men and white men duplicates the relationship of the male child to the father. We have seen how at a certain point, in order to assert his ego, the child must transfer his identification from the female powerlessness to male powerful. And lastly, despite Holmes actually stating in their book that there is no empirical evidence, nor is there any empirical validation for either the myth of black male sexuality or that of sex as compensatory behavior, these are the core tenets of contemporary black masculinity theory that rule supreme today. How do we know that? You can look at something like Bell Hook's book, We Real Cool, which utilizes compensatory masculinity as the basis of various analysis. For example, she says that it is poor black men, young black males, especially particularly underclass males, that often derive a sense of satisfaction from being able to create fear in others, particularly white people. Showing aggression is the simplest way to assert patriarchal manhood. Again, in her analysis of the Central Park Five, utilizing compensatory masculinity, she makes the same claim, right? That if one considers the case by combining the feminist analysis of race and masculinity, one sees that since male power within patriarchy is relative, men from poor groups and men of color are not able to reap the material and social rewards for their participation in patriarchy. No one can believe that the young black males involved in the Central Park incident were not engaged in a suicidal ritual enactment of dangerous masculinity that will ultimately threaten their lives and their well-being. It is naive to think that if they don't value their own lives, this is a subcultural value element, they will value the lives of others. Is it really so difficult for folks to see the connection between the constant pornographic glorification of male violence against women that is represented, enacted, and condoned daily in the culture of the Central Park crime, right? End quote. So what you see then is even contemporary analyses of black masculinity suggest that it's the relative disadvantage of class and race that positions or enables a notion or a kind of performance of a toxic or suicidal ritual of masculinity. Notwithstanding, this is ahistorical because these young men were all innocent. So Hooks ultimately argues that black men rape and abuse women when their masculinity is challenged. Her view is because black men don't have the actual positions in their own communities and homes and relationships, that these men actually respond. They draw from misogyny and sexism to justify their first use of violence, right? So as she says, in romantic relationships with females, particularly romantic bonds, black men experience a disruption of the cool pole. So if you challenge a black man, they respond with anger, sexual predation to maintain their stance. Again, not very different than the same kinds of theorizations you're getting out of the 70s and 80s surrounding how black men act within their own communities. So contemporary intersectionality theory, specific Crenshaw's mapping the margins in footnote 73, utilizes this idea of a race sexualization theory to explain the role that interracial rape plays in the black community. In similar arguments by Frank Reed Cooper in 2006, you see him utilizing contemporary accounts of black masculinity that introduce or emphasize the interracial dynamics of control of violence against black women, children, and sexual minorities, and emulate or mimesis of white masculinity, right? So the idea is that black masculinity at its foundation, because it doesn't have power, is purely mimetic. It's trying to imitate that of the dominant oppressor. And what ends up happening, it imitates that through violence, right? So ethnographic interpretations of black male life, even if you're looking at Gail Garfield's work in 2010, tend to represent black men as being socialized in violence, choosing violence or choosing to perform violence as a way to construct their masculinity. So, black male sexual victimization, however, shows that the racialization effect that black men experience doesn't always tend towards hypersexuality or sexual aggression. Racialization in the United States does not simply pivot black men in a social location where they perform violence. It also is associated with high levels of victimization and high levels of sexual empathy. So in the United States, for instance, if we look at something like 12-month prevalence for contact sexual violence, physical violence, and stalking by a hetero partner, black men is 11.6%, and it's higher than black women or white women in the United States. So historically, black men have experienced the highest rates of intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide among men from 1976 to 1990. And this finding, despite being prevalent within all the clinical and epidemiological literature, is not vastly explained. Said differently, the theorizations that we have of black masculinity predict that sexual violence and domestic violence should be something where black men are almost solely perpetrators. The evidence, however, suggests that the racial location of black men and boys puts them in highly sexualized and violent environments where they're also the predominant victims, at least half of the victims in the black community. Now, this is what this actually looks like in the United States, and we're going by the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the FBI 1998 supplement. Here you see a downward slope with a decrease of homicide of black men, but when you go from 76 forward, you see that black men for over a decade and a half are the predominant victims. If you're doing this per 100,000, you see that black men had the highest rates of intimate partner homicide well into the 1990s. Now remember, most of these theories that we're arguing about were formulated between 1970 and 1990. Despite that, they're not responding to this finding. The only person that tries to explain this, of course, is Wolfgang and Ferracuti, but the only way they do that is by retreating to these racist stereotypes, suggesting that because black women lead households and black men are not patriarchs, black women are killing black men on that basis. This also exists contemporaneously. So we're looking at lifetime and 12-month prevalence of contact sexual violence, physical violence, etc. in the United States in 2010 to 2012. You see black women in 12-month prevalence, right? 9.4 is weighted, 45.1, right? Now we should expect to see race, if we think of the theory of intersectionality, have a compounding effect on how black women and other groups are going to suffer from intimate partner violence. But when we look at black men, look at what we find. The same kind of dynamic. In 12-month prevalence, we see 11.6, with a common between 9.5 and 14.2, as well as a high lifetime prevalence amongst groups of men, right? Where multiracial men, which usually includes some form of blackness, and Native American men or indigenous men suffer the same rates, if not higher over a course of lifetime. Again, suggesting that the ways that we think about masculinity, or at least racialized masculinity, continues to miss the role that vulnerability plays in the socialization effect of how young black men and boys think about themselves in relationships to other groups. So even when we start thinking about black men as perpetrators, which inevitably comes up when we want to talk about this, yes, black men are victims, but they're largely the perpetrating and hurting themselves, that's not exactly true. So black men experience contact sexual violence, which includes rape, major penetrative violence, sexual coercion, and unwanted sexual contact, at slightly higher rates than black women and white women if we're talking about 12-month prevalence. Now, why this is important is because when you contextualize the perpetrators of this kind of violence, right, and we have to admit that over a course of lifetime, women do experience high levels of rape and sexual coercion. When we talk about the perpetrators of made to penetrate violence and sexual coercion and unwanted sexual contact over life course, those perpetrators are women. So it suggests that black men and boys are being socialized in highly violent and sexual environments where women are participating in that kind of racial and sexual subjugation. The current ways that we understand intersectionality and gender theory would almost have us predetermine that the vulnerability of black men are due to other males. That is not historically true, and it certainly doesn't reign true in contemporary works. Now, if you wanted to see the data set that this comes from, we see this here when we look at rape and sexual violence by race and ethnicity. Of course, we see the disproportionate numbers of rape and sexual violence of black women compared to, say, white women or other groups, right? Of course, multiracials, because it usually includes black people and indigenous people, are slightly higher in the United States. But again, when you do a comparison between this, we see the same kinds of disproportionate rates with black men, once you control, of course, that this is for men. So you're not going to have high rates of rape amongst men because those perpetrators are going to be men. But when you look at made to penetrate violence and contact sexual violence, these are things that should worry us because it shows that racialized males, specifically black males, have high levels of sexual victimization. Okay? So again, this is the perpetrator list. That's where you can see that female perpetrators only for sexual coercion, 81%, made to penetrate violence, 78.5%, unwanted sexual contact violence, 53%. So we see high levels of that happening throughout the course of people's lives. Now, what's really interesting as a theorist to this is the ways that categories and conceptualizations are being utilized to essentialize certain black male pathologies as a natural group phenomenon. So the conceptualizations of the group are largely based on presumptions of group tendencies rather than the empirical evidence of how groups actually operate in the real world. So this means that race and gender theories are asserted to be empirically informed when they're merely the deleterious constructions of what a group needs to make their ideological positions cohere. So in the case of black men, stereotypes are used to justify broad-based generalizations of black male behavior and psychology despite evidence to the contrary. So let me just give you a very clear example of that. If you read if you read black masculinity off of the literature of bell hooks, she will predict that black men are hypersexual, are effectively disassociated from early sexual experiences, and tend to dominate women through sexual aggression and domestic violence. When you look at the data, however, it suggests that black men's early sexual experiences are highly effective. They usually choose to have their first intercourse or sexual debut with someone who's a friend, that many of their early sexual experiences are coercive with older women because they have the shortest or earliest age of sexual debut in the United States. And when you look at their victimization broadly, either a statutory rape, made to penetrate violence, or rape itself, these have high levels of men and women doing abuse over the course of life, starting between cohorts of 9 all the way up to 21, right? So that means that the way that we conceptualize the tendencies or how black men think, how they behave, what they actually do, has to be fundamentally rethought and reconceptualized given the actual evidence. We also notice that we live out empirical accounts of sexual minority groups that exhibit higher rates of perpetration or victimization, right? So if you think about, for example, lesbian physical violence or rape physical violence in the dominant white lesbian community or versus heterosexual couples, nobody's going to say that because they have a higher weighted prevalence rate that something essentially is wrong with, right, same-sex groups or queer individuals. Nobody's essentializing the group tendency to the individual, like we do with black men. But we have no problem doing that for black men, even though NISBS data shows that when you look at other groups of men, right, gay, bisexual, or heterosexual men, they have similar, if not higher rates of domestic violence, physical violence, and sexual violence. So the question becomes in our conceptualization or how we think about black men and boys, how is it that black men and boys who have lower rates of perpetration compared to a certain group become essentialized? It's their masculinity that causes the violence. Where other groups that have higher prevalence rates, we don't make those same assertions. And that is purely political. It's about which groups we deem to be liberally acceptable and human versus which groups we ultimately think should be dehumanized and targeted. So this is something that I laid out in Black Male Studies in The Man Not, which draws from previous research on black men that were challenging some of these ideas all the way back to the late 1970s. There were black men writing about masculinity before black feminism came on the scene. And because these were all social scientists, they were making really interesting and innovative arguments about how the definition of black masculinity fundamentally differed from everyone else. And I'd like to point out really quickly that a lot of people give a lot of credit to R.W.S. Connell's work on masculinity to understand hegemonic masculinity, but completely overlook that Robert Staples is cited by R.W.S. Connell as the basis of understanding men who are outside the metropole. She says her theory of marginalized masculinities owes a great debt, is almost totally determined by the work that she read from Robert Staples. So it's interesting that in the United States, black feminists reject Robert Staples' analysis because he disagreed with Audre Lorde and black feminists about the role that sex and race play in the black community, but his work can be cited by someone like R.W.S. Connell as a foundation of marginalized masculinities, and people cite that all day. So black males have provided tremendous social scientific challenges to the prevailing ideas of patriarchy. Earl Miller introduced the idea that patriarchy is a kinship and endogamic system that excludes alien men and produced social systems that were more violent, isolating towards these males than women and other in-group enclaves. Dr. Jim Sedanis, the late William James professor at Harvard, developed the subordinate male target hypothesis, which argues that the most violent forms of social discrimination targets racialized men. And of course, Edwin Lamell Jr. Showed that black males in the United States are not only burdened by racism, but a contradictory system that feminizes and hypermasculizes them simultaneously. These texts are the social scientific basis of the thesis for black male studies that racism is a misandric aggression. If we look at genocides, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, etc., you see high levels of violence against racialized men first and foremost, which also involves sexual victimization. So one of the key pieces that I recently discovered over the last several years was the idea that, that Jewish boys were being raped, or Jewish men were being raped in various camps during the Holocaust. There's only 2 publications on that. The VHA at the Shoah Foundation at USC didn't know they actually had these narratives. So one of the things that my theory predicts is that if you have high levels of targeting and stereotype of racialized men in the society, you also have high levels of sexual victimization and vulnerability. William A. Smith was one of the first people to discover or really introduce the idea of black misandry. He links this to racial battle fatigue. His argument is that the specific negations towards black men have psychological effects that can be measured in terms of depression, various allostatic loads, right, unable to maintain balance, and negative physiological and psychological problems that emerge over time. Anti-black misandry then becomes a foundational idea of how we think about black men operating within patriarchal spaces. Now, while some feminists in the United States are very hostile to the idea of misandry, the evidence is overwhelming that there is a specific outgroup targeting of racialized men that happens in ethnic conflicts, genocides, and even in highly racist regimes. So anti-black misandry then is the cumulative assertion of black male inferiority due to errant psychology of black, dispositions of deviance, or hyperpersonality traits, which rationalize the criminalization, focus, and sanctioning of black male life. So that means that we are theorizing black men through these pathological lens, but all the evidence we have available shows us that not only black men progressive, they're simply the best group of men that have ever existed in Western society. If you take any kind of measure of their attitudes, right? So if you look at their attitudes, their communal and independent concept of manhood. Black men usually, when you do an ethnographic survey of them, do not talk about masculinity. They describe themselves as males or as manhood and father. Second, black men are the most egalitarian male group in the United States history. They not only hold views about women and social equality that surpass most female groups, but are equal to, and in some cases actually surpass the egalitarian beliefs of black women concerning gender politics. Again, this proves evidence for my argument. Because black men have sexual vulnerability built into how they experience racism and the specific targeting, this is why they could understand sexual violence and they could understand the outgroup position that many women have within Western patriarchal society. Third, despite lethal forces imposing themselves on black males in the United States, they remain the most vigilant against dehumanization acts. They are outstanding fathers and family members. The Jamal Love's analysis or summarization of the American National Election Survey data set show that black men and women have more egalitarian values in the United States. Gender does not have a significant predictor to that. So black men have been found to be just as supportive as their female counterparts in supporting affirmative action programs and college diversity initiatives. So ultimately, this argues for a black male studies initiative within the academy that seeks to combat the mythological origin and socialization of black males as violent, socially regressive, and sexually dangerous. Educators and policymakers must look at the social determinants of violence, not masculinity as maleness as a causal element. We need primary educators who must emphasize the mythological nature of contemporary masculinity theories and how they do not apply to the black male circumstance. And we need academic programs that must insist on evidence-based and phenomenological research, emphasizing how black males construct and experience their world. So this checks the interpretive frameworks that emphasize pathology and criminological frameworks passing as liberal political ideology. In other words, you say intersectionality and somehow you know that black men are toxic without any evidence. And it allows for agentic group accounts of research emanating from the group that experiences and can actually verify the theoretical accounts. An example of that would be the study we did about black men's first sexual debut. What are black men telling us about how they view sex, about how they view their first times? Why are they choosing friends? Why they choose to be vulnerable, etc.? These are missing links in how we understand the problem of black masculinity, but more importantly, the positive attributes of how black men and boys are creating a world and how they're actually challenging fundamental notions and assumptions of patriarchy that have not yet been questioned under feminist ideology or intersectional analysis. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know we want to have time for conversations for Dr. Curry's really interesting talk. So first off, good morning. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to Pedro LeBron Ortiz for the invitation and also the kind attention. I apologize. I don't have sufficient Spanish to speak to you. I'll work harder. Next time I'll do better on this. So I want to begin with a short clip of an iconic and perhaps well-known encounter from August Wilson's play Fences. Here we will see the film adaptation starring Denzel Washington, who after talking to his son about the fact that the Pittsburgh Pirates are not giving Roberto Clemente sufficient playing time, has his son ask the question that has been troubling him. I will run the clip now. sound up. Sound. This may not work properly. Yeah, I'm not sure how to get the sound on it. It should be here.
Yeah.
There it is.
I wonder if that is sound. Did he say that there was sound?
Yeah, it is supposed to be.
Maybe it's with in the screen. You got it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know what? I can get past it. Don't worry about it. People, I don't know if people are familiar with this scene, right? It's a troubling scene where Denzel Washington, the person in the scene, Troy, his son, asks him, "Dad, how come you don't like me?" Right? And I'm troubled by the scene, but want to visit it from the perspective of what I've made present in the title of this talk, but it's absent from this conflict between father and son. The missing term is love. And I want to briefly allow us to center our discussion around the manner in which black masculinities are most fundamentally developed around and from the concept of love. When I say that in the aftermath of this video, that begins with the son asking his father a completely different question, why he asked his father, "Don't you like me?" We have first to ask ourselves what would have happened if the son had asked his father a perhaps even less complicated question. Dad, we might imagine August Wilson writing, "Why don't you love me?" I'm a literature professor, so I first have to ask myself why Wilson chose to express this most intimate relationship around the concept of like, when the relationship might more usefully be pursued from the perspective of love and its perceived absence. I say perceived absence because what Wilson actually accomplishes and what troubles our engagement with this scene is that the father Troy is begging his son to understand that what he really wants to say is, it doesn't matter if I like you because I love you. How differently will we understand the scene and the problematic, and how differently we understand the scene and the problematic and the problematic if Troy masterfully played by Denzel Washington if he had said, "Son, I love you." I propose to perhaps provocatively two things. First, that Troy, by not saying the word love, is saying just that. And second, that the construction of the world and its dynamic anti-blackness has his father dealing first with what I will propose is the first philosophy of white supremacy, humiliation. Humiliation that makes it nigh on impossible for something that we will reduce to being called black male love here to be expressed under the pressure this father feels and what he believes his real duty to his son. Recall in the text, his son asked, "How come you ain't never liked me?" It is telling that Troy, the father, never answers the question. He asks another one to avoid what is too complicated for this moment, the term love. He asks, "Like you, who the hell say I gotta like you? What laws there say I got to like you?" Troy, when we read this carefully and sympathetically, is asking his son to help him by saying the words that he cannot say. He needs his son to say that the law that says he has to like him is the fact that he loves him, and neither one of them is in a position to make that move. This brings me to the principal concern here that I'm hoping to bring to our awareness in this discussion of black masculinity, where I've been asked to contribute to it by paying attention to something like cognition in my way of framing it that leads to a form of consciousness that allows for new ways of being. The question I want to deal with is what form of cognition? How do Troy and his son, Corey, need to see the world differently to be conscious of the possibility of being in the world differently? Or perhaps a more revolutionary stance might be to wonder how this altered cognition, consciousness, and being can lead to a different world, not just the possibility of being different in the world. This is important because what August Wilson's text reveals is that Troy struggles with the world, and that fight makes it impossible for him to show love for his family, whether he is in love with them or not. Recall the dialogue. Troy says, "Like you, I go out here every morning, bust my butt, putting up with them crackers every day because I like you." Asking the question, "You about the biggest fool I ever saw. It's my job. It's my responsibility. You understand that a man got to take care of his family. You live in my house, sleep on my bedclothes, fill your belly with my food because you're my son." And there it is. The cause that should have been said, the cause at the end that should have been said, is "because I love you," is obstructed by the reality that in this world that Troy lives in, his highest duty, which he calls taking care of his son, is to let him know that he is black and a man that the world will try to at least break him down, and failing that encounter to kill him, and failing that ensure that he is so humiliated in front of those that he loves that he can't even afford to like them. What he can do, and all he can do, is where the conversation with his son ends, saying the following, quote, "Don't you try and go through life worrying about if somebody likes you or not. You best be making sure they're doing right by you," close quote. Because, and this is obvious in some sense to all of us in this room, we've spent some of our time over the last day being concerned about the deadly effects of colonialism white supremacy, anti-blackness, and what I want to index here for purposes of our conversation, a way of being black male in this world that makes it impossible in some sense to properly love. The challenge before us, and through the kind of study that Professor Curry is developing, it offers us from this perspective tools of cognition to see the world differently through the statistical evidence that Tommy offered, to then understand that the world is not the way that it appears to these people, and that love is the foundational proposition that will then allow us both to read the data more sympathetically and empathetically as well, and also come to this conclusion that the starting point for something like black masculinity and black study needs to be something like love. Thank you.
Yeah, so I get pushback all the time. You know, I'm pretty sure half of the academy hates me, but I have evidence and they don't. So, you know, people, when you study racialized men, the first reaction is always going to be that something's wrong with you, right? It's the black men, in my experience for the last decade, studying black men and boys is the only group that if you even want to understand them, people try to say something's wrong with you for that. Because the idea is that they are already understood, they're already violent, they're already irredeemable, et cetera. So black male studies is the only discipline that I know of that's actually utilizing evidence and ethnographic accounts from black men to try to theorize the group. You're going to get pushback, people are gonna call you names, you will actually lose some jobs for doing this. But to this very day, I mean, this book was published in 2017. I started doing work on this in 2015. It's almost been a decade. There's not one person that refuted any of my findings, right? And that's the biggest problem, is that you can call me a sexist, you call me a patriarch, you call me whatever you want, but the data is irrefutable on this point. And the more data that we constantly bring out, like I did a literature review, a scientific literature review on child sexual assault. The data, it aligned with my theory of sexual vulnerability. I'm publishing a systematic review of intimate partner violence currently, using some of the data that I showed you. It shows the same thing. So you're gonna get pushback, but I think the thing is, know the data and then know the origins of the theories. Because I think that it became very clear in the audience that many of the things that you learn in your gender classes really is just recycled racist criminology. And it's really important for us to know that if we're trying to fight white supremacy and anti-blackness, why are we then using the tools that we've largely rejected for racism, like subcultural violence theory, as the basis of determining and understanding black masculinity? Hello. Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yeah, but could you give me a specific author that you think would fundamentally change my analysis? So if you're making the claim, yeah, yeah, and I disagree with that. So is there an intersectional feminist that has an account of black male marginalization? Is there an intersectional black feminist that has an account of black male sexual victimization, or vulnerability? It's not loaded. It's a very simple question. No, I'm not. I'm asking if there's a study published that says that black men suffer because of their sex, not primarily based on race. Very simple question. No, there's not. No, I know there's not. So I'm asking. Exactly. So that means it makes no contribution to my area of research. If it's not a topic of study, ma'am. But ma'am, here's what I'm saying. You're making claims about narrowness, and I'm willing to have that debate with you because I've read practically everything intersectional feminists have argued about black men. But what I'm saying is, if you have an author, that's not what I'm saying. Not what I'm saying, ma'am. What I'm saying is, if it's published about black men and it claims to be intersectional, I've read that. And what I'm asking you is, do you have an author or a resource that you can say, this person argues X, and I think it would challenge, add to your thesis? Because if you're making the broad claim about intersectional feminism, then the most cited research in intersectional feminism on black masculinity is Kimberly Crenshaw, people who read Bell Hooks as intersectional feminists, I don't know why, and Frank Rudy Cooper. Though, if you go to Google Scholar right now, those are your top 3 or 4 citations. So what I'm suggesting is, maybe somewhere out there that exists. But in terms of the actual literature and literature comparison, the only people arguing that sex is a deleterious category are going to be social dominance theorists because they disagree with intersectional social psychologists, right? Or intersectional invisibility theorists who are going to argue that gender disjuncts black women from the racial category, which is an arbitrary set discrimination causing violence. So while that may be an interesting debate that's happening in the United States and Canada amongst social scientists, there is not anything that makes the specific claim that within patriarchal Western societies, black men are both lethally targeted and sexually vulnerable because of patriarchal norms, which is exactly the basis and foundation of black male studies. Yeah, and that's fine. I will wait your citations because nobody cites these people you're telling me about in this area. And again, the studies that I'm drawing for are comparative. You're saying they're from a U.S. context, but the United States, Canada, UK, and Africa, because I serve on many dissertations, both in all through those countries, do not have any of these claims. So if you, I understand that as well. But what I am telling you is, when you're serving as an external examiner for people who are doing subordinate or subaltern masculinities, none of these citations appear. So I'm more than happy to look at your literature review. But to suggest that this is somehow a misrepresentation of the dominant forms and the most cited forms of intersectional analysis is simply incorrect. Right? Not a misrepresentation, but a very limited analysis. Well, I mean, you talk to Google Scholar algorithms about that. Yeah. I don't know how to compensate or address an argument where the most dominant and cited forms of literature on idea, both in social science and the humanities, is is represented and challenged by my analysis. For you to say, well, that's not the dominant form of literature and it's narrow. So again, I'm more than willing to look at your literature review or whatever the sources you may have, but to then say that this somehow misunderstands, misrepresents, or is narrow, overlooks the very metrics we use to decide what the authoritative text in a field actually
And
are.
in the United States.
No, and in Europe, because I teach in the UK,
Okay,
and in
and Europe.
EU, and in Africa, right?
That's the country of Africa?
Multiple countries in Africa have different relationships with EU countries. So like in Europa, for instance, those people have different relationships with UK universities. And in that world where gender is being taken up, specifically the study of African masculinities, these things do not appear. So the most cited authors, for example, in Africa are going to be like Lunga or Archipelago. So those people are not making these kinds of arguments. Again, there may be innovative resources that I'm happy to look at, but that is not the dominant form by which African masculinities, black masculinities, or even subordinate masculinities, like people like Sophia Ayum use to actually study Portuguese men, are utilized.
So you
That's
come
all I'm
to a
saying.
Spanish
Let's stop it there. We could keep the conversation, outside so other people could kind of ask questions and make comments. So, it's,
I do just want to support the point, though, that there is vast literature of Black queer studies and Black LGBTQ studies, right? That you haven't addressed that Professor Saunders is also talking about that has as its central thesis, right, talking about constructions of Black masculinity. So
Again, I completely understand that point.
yeah.
My question is not about the various constructions of black masculinity. E. Patrick Johnson, Dylan Carbado, all people who study these kinds of areas. What I'm saying is that their analysis is ultimately wrong. So for example, in the intersectional framework, Carbado would argue that the only axis of disadvantage on a male for dealing with melanis is going to be sexual minoritization. He still thinks that melanis as a category represents privilege that has to be disjunct from that through some performance of queerness. I'm saying that that's incorrect because the sociological data does not support that racialized men generally in a society have privilege. Now, there are no, to my knowledge, queer theorists making that misandric argument because it's not based on identity, it's based on the social location that racialized men take in Western patriarchal society. In other words, even if you do disaggregate by queerness, you would not get the same kind of reproducible results over life course or within 12-month prevalence that black male studies give. Because they don't
say
disaggregate.
that they have a specific perspective, you cannot say that it's wrong.
I can say it's not empirically
You can say that
validated.
you can't say that it's wrong if you're taking patriarchy and heteronormativity seriously. That's I think the point.
That's just wrong. If your argument's true, then why do black boys have their earliest sexual debut in the United States despite sexual orientation?
Are you actually engaging with scholars like Rod Ferguson? Have you
I've read Ferguson, I've read Carbado, who's the guy that does all the stuff on sexual debut? It's a white guy out of Illinois, right? Even domestic violence. Why then would you find that black men who identify as either heterosexual or queer to have almost the same rates of sexual vulnerability?
So then I would ask you, how exactly you're defining sexual vulnerability?
Early sexual debut.
I think it would be more productive to have this conversation after.
No, because I'm really.
I just think that what
that's fine.
Professor Saunders is saying is that there is a vast literature that takes this as a central focal point.
And I'm saying that's incorrect.
And it feels like you're dismissing it.
That's fine, but what I'm saying is that that's incorrect. There are currently no studies that are translated into English, right, that explore sexual victimization or rape. Outside of the United States, that's fine. What I'm saying in terms of national data sets now, cross-sectional data, what I am saying very simply is if you're looking at child sexual abuse, made to penetrate violence, and the life course of sexual assault and sexual vulnerability, there are practically no English-speaking texts that write about that. Because when you do the systematic reviews, they simply don't exist. We don't even have a systematic review on intimate partner violence in the black community in the 21st century. So we can make theoretical arguments of what we think can be considered,
No, I
but the
actually
data is
have a
not.
specific text for you. It's actually based in the period of slavery, and he talks about exactly what you're talking about.
That is not what I'm talking about. Rape during slavery is not what I'm arguing about. I'm
But it says the historical context.
It could possibly, yes.
So
I've read all that.
Let's move
That's
on.
not. I don't want to move on because this is an important point. We need to stop making generalizations about about what happened during slavery as if they explained the epidemiological and clinical findings
You
of the 20th
asked
century.
for a source. You
No,
asked for
ma'am.
a source.
What I'm saying
Yes, you
is
did.
that there is
So-
not a data summary that exists in English that allows us to track over life course, child sexual abuse, made to penetrate violence, and male victimization of sexual assault.
Within the particular set of data that you're looking at, though,
Okay.
I just want you to recognize
No, I
that
disagree
maybe
with
your
you.
data is limited.
Okay, we'll keep it moving. You got a question up here?
And thank you to Tanya and the colleagues for making, I was going to make kind of a similar argument, but this already has been made. But I had another point about your engagement with culture of poverty in
Yes.
your research. A lot of the examples you were giving in on the 70s, particularly the second wave feminist scholars, were also in a way pathologizing, but kind of like putting, like not necessarily touching culture of poverty, but based on culture of poverty theory.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what is your engagement with that? And also I wanted to know a little bit more about what happens particularly with war trauma, specifically with, because I know a lot of this research was made particularly during Vietnam, you know, and so it's based on PTSD and trauma in the war field, and so I'm interested in that.
So when you say culture of poverty, I'm assuming you're talking about Oscar Lewis's work?
Yes.
Yeah. So culture of poverty arguments roughly do the same thing. They were short precursors in the 1950s and 1960s to subculture violence theory before it got picked up by the criminologists. So Oscar Lewis's arguments read the exact same as Wolfgang and Farrakhan's, with the exception that they're not interested purely in crime. They're interested in how there's certain kind of reproducible antisocial values lead one to low socioeconomic status and the inability to get out of a subculture, right? Now that's of course framed, as we know, by within war, is also framed by depression and economic struggles, because during that same period of time, it's prefaced by John Dollard's research study, which formed the basis of mine in '65, which was about the racing caste in the southern town, where he said that there's a specific psychology of segregated black people that dooms them to reproduce the same poverty and failures that you're gonna have. So what happened there is social stratification was moved from kind of a system of segregation to rather to a system of psychology that was internalized by these people that was gonna reproduce itself generation after generation after generation, right? So my work does deal with that. So like my other publications talk about how this is an antecedent for even how we think of subculture analysis in Bell Hooks' work, which is why poverty is always linked to deviance, gangsterism, and hypermasculinity.
Yeah, but I mean, what is kind of like really important, and I'm thinking more of the case of Puerto Rico and how it kind of like links completely to a lot of the pathology of masculinity that you're describing. It's the issue of the matriarchal, right, or the matrifocal family, right? And this is, I mean, not only general for the African American experience, but it's just the fact for many Afro-Caribbean and Afro-diasporic and many African families. So even if the father figure is present, the focus and the center of the family is always the mother.
Right.
I guess that from some of your explanations, I mean, it seems that the question of matriarchy, of the matrifocal family, it's kind of like, I mean, again, it's like going back to blame the mother as the kind of like the center of the violence and the control of the family. It's again getting back into a lot of other issues, right?
Yeah, that's not, Black Belt Studies doesn't have that. Black Belt Studies is makes the argument that the idea of the matriarchal family arises from the apatriarchality of the black or racialized male. So we see this, what we call the phallicism of Black Belt Studies. You see this idea reproduced even within the Jewish community, right? During the Holocaust. The idea that Jewish men were hypermasculine, spread syphilis, but then on the other hand, they're feminine, so they menstruate. This was the same kind of argument that was happening in the turn of the 20th century. So Black Belt Studies is not endorsing the idea that female-led households produce that. What I'm saying is that the origin of the theories that become the basis of contemporary gender theory, right, originate from a blame of the matriarchal family imbuing black men with hypermasculinity. So said differently, you can read practically bell hooks or any feminist analysis of black masculinity, and toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity are going to be mentioned. In fact, there was a literature review by class that made that argument. And over 70% of the actual literature published about racialized men, meaning black or brown, involved the language of hypermasculinity. That literature assumes that black men are compensatory, right? That brown men are compensatory. But what's often left out of that analysis is that that comes from an argument about matriarchy. So hypermasculinity is utilized to talk about the excess of male characteristics. But what's often left out of the history of it by people like Kusama and all the studies is that they were studying boys in female-led households and how that led to the internalization of a female sex role that then produced deviance and the overexertion of masculine characteristics to compensate. So all black male studies scholars are saying is that that's a misunderstanding of the origin of the term and has huge implications for how we're actually applying it in real life. So black male studies makes no claim about matriarchal-led households because we know that if you're actually looking at variants of, say, violence, deviance, etc., or even in the black community in the United States, black men don't have to be married to have an influence on their children, and socioeconomic status becomes a variability or a significant variable in predicting the outcome and success of many of these groups. So it's too reductive to say that a female-led household has a certain determinant outcome.
I'm just gonna ask one question to Michael. So I've been thinking a lot about that talk you gave, I think 1 or 2 years ago maybe, with Fred Bowen and Stefano, where you broke down, that, famous Allen Iverson interview, right? And how, and now listening to you today, I'm thinking about, how black masculine love is illegible. And going back to that talk, you kind of breaking down how the reporter, he couldn't fathom, he couldn't understand, or see, Iverson's pain, his friend being killed. Like, it's just, so I don't know, just made me think about that. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but I just, it made me think about that talk and how it's
I
illegible.
think, and I'll try to make it relevant to what's going on here, right? I think, and I'm not trying to say Tommy or mediate his argument, but I think Tommy is in his work operating from a place of love of black, right? And some of that becomes illegible, and I agree that there's a body of literature that's not in English, that he characterized by saying in English, right? There's a lot of non-English speaking literature that takes up feminist difficulty, right? That is going to enhance and be able to speak correctly to your thing. But if you proceed, my point in what I kind of briefly talked about is proceeding from a place of like love that allows us to meet in a space of mutual conversation. I think it's generative for just this type of productive conversation, right, that has to be had. And what happens to this point, the Iverson clip I use is Iverson is viewed as kind of this hyper-masculine person that has no feelings outside of just what's happening in basketball, right? His entire point was there's a whole world that's going on, and you're talking to me about practice, right? And I think that in many ways, what you're doing is a particular type of practice, right? Black male studies is a particular type of practice, right? And what you're proposing, I think what's happening is we have to figure out how to meet in a space where the language, even as basic as different linguistic traditions, and also the conversation has a common thread, whether that's practice, the game, or rehearsal, in order to talk about what we're actually describing, right? Because what you're proposing is a way that does just that, I think, is allows us to have a coherent view as to what it means to be black in the world, right? And you're approaching it from a specific place that then can also be enhanced or be questioned by other traditions, but that requires a type of egalitarian practice, right? It requires a type of mutual point of engagement that sounds to me a lot like a typology of love, for love of a particular type of people. And I think it's the entire point of the reason that this conference is being done. And that's obviously this practice.
So you
Yeah.
had a question?
So it's gonna be, I'm gonna make one question for both of you, but I wanna make a point first. I'm a second year student, graduate student, doing a master's in translation. So I'm not asking, but I'm just saying to all the local scholars, why are we not using that program, which is heavily underfunded, as it being heavily underfunded because of the budget cuts? Why are we not using that research, that graduate program of the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, to work towards towards translating those words and publishing them in English, because we have our resources here, and we could bridge that gap we had earlier. And that program chairperson is Dr. Aurora Lausaldo. It's always open towards all kinds of work. And I'm willing and open to work within that program towards publishing those work, because those, those voices do need to be heard. And again, to bridge the gap. And for both of you, the question I have is, Professor Sawyer, you talk about love, and you both brought on about, obviously it's about male masculinity. Obviously Puerto Rico society, the US society, European society is very different, but all things that we have in common is that black men or black male figures are brought up to be tough, are you're supposed to be the manliest of men and stuff, and that's something that's been that's a constant. Even when you're growing up, you gotta be tough. When you, even in the dating life, when you do not maintain some kind of tropes, you're being seen as not manly enough. How did you see, or how did you suggest we can move as a society on breaking out of those tropes, of those expectations that we do have as black men towards a society that may be more progressive and open for specifically black men in this case?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because most black men don't hold that view about themselves, right? So we don't have evidence suggesting, at least in the United States and Canada, that black men view themselves in that way. What we do find is that people view black men that way. So until we can refute or change the conceptualization or psychology that people have in viewing black men, that structure is going to be predetermined for them, right? So for example, if you look at the neurological scan for people interaction or what's called potential deficit or potential resources, a black man walks into a room and automatically he's going to be bigger, stronger, more aggressive than any other male counterpart in the group culture, right? When people see black men, hear black names, scary figures, snakes, spiders, danger, right, appear. So, like I said, the science on that suggests that there's not going to be a mediation of the dehumanization that black men experience in any context, right, throughout various Western societies. So, it has to be a deliberate and policy-based intervention that's actually gauging and marrying how these racialized men are being perceived, right? Because remember, the Sedanius work looks at every G8 country, every Western capitalistic society that even engages or has the kind of bifurcation that this operates in. So the research showing that this is a foundational feature of Western capitalistic society has been pretty much solidified. And he doesn't think that you can change it. Because negative social capital is always going to be attributed to cohorts of racialized men, be they erratic, be they black, brown, pick your poison. That's just how racialization operates.
Anybody have any other questions, comments? Nope. All right, thanks again, Michael and Tommy. Appreciate it.
like what university?
I don't know. I have 1 year
Yeah,
to start.
it really depends, right? I mean, Michael obviously graduated from Africana Studies program at Brown. So, I mean, that's a very prestigious program. I mean, you know, if you're more Afrocentric, of course, there's Temple, you know, and it's just a lot of different places. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to go for, you know, what your perspective is, how you want to educate.
I would like to work towards something like bridging like a gap I see between like I was looking. I have a purpose of Michigan State. He actually was the host for one of the panels this week, and I see that there's a gap between Latino studies and between Black or African diaspora studies. So I would like to work something along those lines because that's something I see that not like that's not the main focus on any of my courses. So that's what I'm thinking of. That's what my end goal would be.
Right, right. Yeah, you should email them. We should talk. We should get some. Get you out.
I was taking notes because I'm looking for
No problem. No problem.
Un blog donde la gente puede escribir sobre eso.
Do you mind if I take a picture of the color?
Es una página web que va a ser una página muy interactiva. Y me gustaría que los contactos con los de y que la gente diga, venga, yo necesito un estudio de esto, punto. No solamente. Y bueno, va a tener ahí, yo tengo huelgas, el pueblo que tiene y esa idea para que comentemos probablemente la primera vez la salida de claro, o sea, la idea es español en español inglés. Español inglés. Yo lo que tengo es una sinopsis de vida, ¿cierto? Con su ICD, todas sus cosas, su presentación, que la gente quiere comprarlo. Que la gente quiere comprarlo. Allí lo compra, pero también que ellos tengan un espacio de trabajo, como dice ella, para estar escribiendo sobre ese tema. Sí, porque es que no lo tenemos, o sea, no lo tenemos, o sea, todo está pegado, todo está pegado. Entonces yo lo que estoy haciendo es, ¿cómo se llama el proyecto? From Good, pero el proyecto se va a seguir Black Power One. A ver, ya, yeah, that's why I asked the question. The platform, do you want citation involved? Will like translate it into something plain white.
That's exactly that. So, it's like, the problem I have is like, it's always the disposition that we've already solved your problem. Right, so a black man comes together and says, black man, here are issues of sexuality, child abuse, what's the problem? Oh, we've already solved it. Really, where's the data? Oh, what's the victim attitude? Well, what's the offer? I'll give them to you.
Pero bueno, entonces si quieres
It's reform. You have to get into seriously engage the argument. I come here and show you data, you see sources, you see quotes. You're saying to somebody, tell me the name of the book. Where should I go to look at it? Right? Or you tell me this data, and I'm like, I call bullshit. Why? Because right, this Puerto Rico is a U.S. Okay, so like, it's not like the CDC is coming over here and doing separate data collection for Puerto Rico. That's not what's happening, right? So, you know, I mean, that's what I'm saying. That's why I call bullshit. I'm so angry because I'm like, I'm tired of it. You're gonna engage me. Engage me in what we actually think. CDC is not letting national data specifically for there's not a Puerto Rico data collection agency that I can go to a website and pull in the branch of Puerto Rico.
I work as a journalist. Well, right now I'm working as social media manager. The data in particular is never readily available. We have to go through
know, because when I study, like the only things that you can get unless you go through Winswap, which doesn't include Puerto Rico, is gonna be state by state reporting. And UCR and FBI don't collect the same thing in Puerto Rico. So you see what I'm saying? Like, so you're telling me, oh, there's data, oh, there's data, but I know there's not. So if your scholars weren't using that data, how do they do what I do? You know,
Which is something that I appreciate very much about Puerto Rico. We do not use just to the full, we do not use our resources to the full extent. I'm studying, as I was saying, I study translation. We have a graduate program that focuses on translation, which there are not a lot of them. So what we have to work in a world in our country. Whether we like it or not, none of these academics are English. And we get translated in English, even in class. It's very hard for you to get a bachelor's degree without speaking English.
Everybody's gonna have things that you don't understand. I'm sorry for that we don't. It's suggested with whoever doing this work, that's never cited, appears in any kind of Google citation kind of setup. That's why I was like, look, this is tested. And if you're writing about what you know what I'm saying? You know, that's always hard. So yeah, that's what I mean, study black people get a lot of. Yeah. No,
No sé si es lo más pasar Pablo Luis Rivera, el profesor de acá también.
thanks for coming.
We work together at Colorado College.
Okay, nice.
He's down there at the University of Florida.
Yeah, I teach Mr. Costa.
That's Tommy Curry. Listen, man, listen, I can be friends, that's not the problem.
I can't imagine it.
What I will tell you is that no matter how many. Every time when I was a freshman, first time I was thinking about this issue of academic self-organizing, because I came to see the
Igual.